Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I had been out with a few friends after work. We weren't doing anything too crazy. Just a small bar near the office. It was one of those nights where you're not drinking much but somehow still end up exhausted. I remember glancing at the time and thinking it was way too late for me to be out on a weekday. The bar was starting to empty out, and I realized it was time to go. I didn't drive to the bar. I never did if I knew I'd be drinking at all, even a little. So I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare like I usually do. It only took a few minutes for the app to match me with a driver. His name was something generic like Mark, and his profile looked normal. The car was supposed to be a gray sedan. I stepped out of the bar and stood by the curb, refreshing the app a couple of times, watching the little car icon on the map get closer. I was kind of zoned out, just waiting, feeling the night air cool me down. It had been a busy day at work, and I was ready to collapse into bed. That's when I saw a gray car pull up. I was tired, probably a little too tired to be thinking straight. The car looked like the one in the app, and the timing was about right, so I assumed it was my ride. I didn't check the plate like I usually do. I just opened the back door and got in. The first thing I noticed was that there was no chime from the app saying your ride is starting. That was my first red flag, but I ignored it. The driver didn't say much when I got in, just nodded at me through the rearview mirror. He was a middle-aged guy, clean-shaven, wearing a baseball cap. The car smelled faintly of air freshener, that fake lemon kind that you get from the grocery store. He didn't confirm my name, which I thought was weird, but again, I was tired, so I didn't think much of it. We pulled out onto the main road, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. I wasn't paying close attention. I just stared out the window, scrolling through my phone, half zoning out, half trying to stay awake. I think I even nodded off for a minute or two. But then something started to feel wrong. The route we were taking didn't look familiar. I know the way home from that bar like the back of my hand because I've taken it so many times. We were supposed to take a right at the intersection near the bar, but instead, we went left. At first, I thought maybe he was avoiding traffic or taking a shortcut. But then we kept going through more lights, down streets I didn't recognize. I leaned forward a bit, glancing at the app again. It hadn't updated. No ride was showing as active. My stomach dropped. I think you missed a turn back there, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Just kept driving. His eyes flicked up to the rearview mirror for a second, but he didn't say a word. I felt my heart start to race. Hey, I'm pretty sure my place is the other way, I said, louder this time, hoping maybe he hadn't heard me the first time. Again, no response. Just silence, and the road stretching out in front of us, getting darker and more unfamiliar. I could see the lights of the city fading in the distance as we drove further out of town. I started to panic. I opened the app again, trying to see if maybe I'd made a mistake. But the car that was supposed to pick me up was still stuck on the map a few streets away. This wasn't my ride. Stop the car, I said, my voice shaking now. Let me out. He didn't stop. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands were shaking as I gripped my phone, trying to figure out what to do. I glanced at the door handle. It didn't have a lock button that I could see. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how I could get out, but the car was still moving too fast. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I said, "Stop the car." I shouted this time, hoping maybe I could startle him into listening. He glanced at me in the mirror again, his eyes narrowing. "Just relax. You'll get where you need to go," he said, his voice flat, almost cold. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I knew then that this was deliberate. This wasn't some misunderstanding or wrong turn. He wasn't taking me home. He had no intention of taking me home. I started frantically texting my friend, sending her my location from the app. "I'm in the wrong car," I typed. "Something's wrong. Call the police." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hit the buttons. The car turned off the main road, heading down a side street. There were fewer and fewer lights now, and I realized we were heading toward the outskirts of the city. The houses were spaced out, with large patches of darkness in between them. I couldn't see anyone outside. No one to flag down. No one to help me. I hit the door handle, pulling at it as hard as I could, but it didn't budge. It was locked from the front, and there was no way for me to unlock it from the back seat. I pounded on the window, hoping maybe someone would see me, but there was no one around. "Let me out!" I screamed, my voice cracking with fear. The driver just laughed. It was a low, quiet laugh, and it sent chills down my spine. "You'll be fine," he said, almost mockingly. "Just sit tight." I felt a tear slip down my cheek, but I wiped it away quickly, refusing to let him see how scared I was. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. The car was still moving, and I knew if I didn't do something soon, I might not get another chance. I looked around the back seat, searching for anything I could use. My purse was on the seat next to me, and I dug through it, my fingers closing around my keys. They were the only thing I had that could potentially help me. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped them, but I held on tight. Without thinking, I leaned forward and jabbed the key into the back of his seat, aiming for where I thought his back would be. He let out a grunt, jerking the steering wheel to the side, and the car swerved. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, his voice no longer calm. I didn't answer. I stabbed the key into the seat again, this time harder, and he let out a louder grunt, swerving the car even more. The car slowed down, and I took my chance. I grabbed the handle again, yanking at it with all my strength, and finally, it gave way. The door swung open, and I threw myself out of the moving car. I hit the pavement hard, rolling onto the gravel shoulder of the road. My skin burned from the impact, and I felt the air leave my lungs, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline pushing me forward, and I ran. I could hear the car screech to a stop behind me, and I heard the door slam. He was coming after me. But I didn't look back. I just kept running, my feet pounding against the pavement, my heart racing in my chest. I could see lights up ahead, maybe a house, maybe a gas station. I didn't care what it was, as long as there were people there. I heard his footsteps behind me, getting closer, but I didn't stop. I forced myself to run faster, even though my lungs were burning and my legs felt like they were going to give out. I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Finally, I reached the light. It was a small convenience store, still open, and I burst through the door, gasping for breath. The clerk behind the counter looked up, startled, as I slammed the door behind me, locking it. "Call the police," I gasped, leaning against the counter, trying to catch my breath. "Please, call the police." The clerk grabbed the phone, dialing as he stared at me with wide eyes. I turned to look out the window, but the man was gone. His car was gone. By the time the police arrived, I was shaking so badly I could barely speak. I told them what had happened, but there wasn't much they could do. The man had disappeared, and I hadn't gotten a good look at the license plate. They said they'd investigate, but I could tell they didn't expect to find him. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. I didn't want to know. All I knew was that I was lucky to have gotten away. I deleted the rideshare app that night and swore I'd never use it again. It started late one night. I was in bed, reading a book to try and fall asleep. I don't usually have trouble sleeping, but for some reason that night, I couldn't. Maybe it was because I had too much coffee earlier, or maybe it was just one of those nights where your mind won't shut off. Whatever the reason, I was wide awake, even though it was past midnight. My apartment is in a quiet area, a small place on the edge of town. I've been living here for a couple of years, and nothing strange has ever happened. It's not like I get a lot of visitors, especially at that hour. So when I heard the soft tapping on my window, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It wasn't much, just a light, almost unnoticeable tap. The kind of sound you might ignore if you weren't paying attention. But I was alone in the apartment, and it was dead quiet, so I couldn't help but notice it. I stopped reading and sat still, listening. Nothing. After a few seconds of silence, I figured it was nothing. Maybe a branch brushing against the window or something. I went back to my book and tried to focus on the words, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Then, a minute later, there it was again. Tap, tap, tap. It was so soft that I almost convinced myself it was the wind. But then again, it wasn't windy that night. It didn't sound like a branch or leaves. It sounded deliberate. Like someone was gently tapping on the glass, trying not to be too loud. I sat up and turned my head toward the window. My room is on the second floor, and the window faces a small alleyway. There's nothing but a couple of old buildings across from me, and no one really goes through there except for the occasional cat or stray dog. I got out of bed and walked over to the window. I don't know why I felt so uneasy. I mean, it was probably nothing. Still, I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. Nothing. Just the dark alley and the dim streetlight at the end of it. No movement, no people. I stood there for a few seconds, feeling a little silly for being so jumpy, and then let the curtain fall back into place. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it had been a bird or something. I got back into bed, trying to ignore the way my stomach was tightening up. For a while, there was nothing. Just the usual sounds of the night. I started to relax again, picking up my book and trying to lose myself in the story. It was quiet enough that I could hear the hum of the fridge in the kitchen, the distant sound of a car driving by on the main road. Normal stuff. Then, just as I was starting to feel calm again, the tapping came back. But this time, it wasn't soft. It was louder. And it was coming from the same window. 3 quick taps, almost impatient. Tap. 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 I froze. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was out there. Standing just outside my window, on the second floor, tapping on the glass. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my mouth went dry. I didn't move. I didn't want to. I just stared at the window, hoping that maybe I'd imagined it again. But I knew I hadn't. Another tap. I sat there, my mind racing. Who the hell would be outside my window at this time of night? How were they even up here? The fire escape was on the other side of the building, and there was no ledge or anything they could stand on. It didn't make sense. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? That someone was tapping on my window? It sounded ridiculous. I hadn't even seen anyone yet. I took a deep breath and forced myself to get out of bed again. This time, I was a lot more nervous as I approached the window. My feet felt heavy, and I could feel my palms sweating. Every step I took toward the window made me feel like something bad was about to happen. I reached for the curtain, hesitated for a second, then yanked it open. Nothing. The alley was empty, just like before. No one was there. No sign that anyone had been there at all. The streetlight flickered for a moment, casting long shadows across the alleyway, but nothing moved. I pressed my face up to the glass, scanning every corner of the alley, trying to see if maybe someone was hiding out of sight. But it was dead quiet. I stood there for a few minutes, my breath fogging up the glass, waiting for anything to happen. But nothing did. Finally, I let the curtain fall back into place and backed away from the window. My heart was still racing, but I didn't know what else to do. There was no one out there. I was sure of it. Maybe I had just been hearing things. I got back into bed again, feeling on edge, but there wasn't much else I could do. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just overreacting. I tried to read my book again, but I couldn't focus. Every little sound made me jump. The creak of the building settling, the distant hum of the city, the ticking of my clock, it all felt louder, more intense. Then the tapping came back. This time, it was hard and fast, like someone was pounding on the window with their fist. I jumped out of bed, my heart nearly stopping. The sound was so loud it felt like the glass was going to shatter. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was definitely outside my window. I grabbed my phone off the nightstand, my hand shaking as I dialed 999. I didn't care if it sounded crazy anymore. Someone was out there, and I wasn't about to wait around and find out who or why. As the phone rang in my ear, I crept back toward the window, but this time, I didn't pull the curtain open. I just stood there, waiting, listening to the tapping getting louder and more frantic. Finally, the operator picked up, and I explained what was happening, trying to keep my voice steady. They told me they'd send someone over right away, but it would take a few minutes. A few minutes felt like hours. The tapping kept going, growing louder and louder. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what else to do. I just stood in the middle of my room, clutching my phone, waiting for the sound of sirens. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. Silence. I stood there, frozen, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The apartment was completely still again, like the night itself had been holding its breath. I waited. 1 minute. 2 minutes. 5 minutes. But the tapping didn't start again. Finally, I heard the distant wail of a police siren, and I felt a small wave of relief. I rushed to the front door and let them in, explaining what had happened as best I could. They checked the alley, the building, everything. But there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, no ladder, nothing. It was like whoever or whatever had been tapping on my window had vanished into thin air. The officers were nice enough, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. They said they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night, but there wasn't much else they could do. After they left, I locked every door and window in the apartment, double-checked them all, then went back to bed. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the tapping, still feel that overwhelming sense of dread. I don't know who it was or how they even managed to get to my window, but I haven't been able to shake the feeling that they might come back. It was late when I pulled into the gas station. I didn't even realize how far out of town I was until I saw the sign for it. I had been driving for hours and the last thing I wanted was to stop in the middle of nowhere, but my fuel gauge was blinking and there wasn't another station for miles. I wasn't in a position to be picky, so I turned into the lot. The place looked run down, like it hadn't seen a lot of traffic in a long time. There was only one pump, and the light above it was flickering. The building itself was small, with a grimy window and a sign that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. A single car was parked off to the side, but there was no sign of anyone else. I pulled up to the pump, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The air was cold, biting through my jacket, and the wind was eerily quiet. I tried not to think about how deserted the place felt. I just wanted to fill up and get back on the road. As I started pumping the gas, I glanced over toward the building. Through the window, I could see the gas station attendant sitting behind the counter. He was staring at me. Not in the way someone casually looks at a customer, but in this unsettling, fixed way. His eyes didn't move, they stayed locked on me, like he was waiting for something. I looked away quickly, trying to shake off the discomfort. It wasn't a big deal, I told myself. He was probably just bored, or maybe I was the first customer he'd had in hours. Still, it felt wrong. I focused on the pump, willing the numbers to move faster. But after a minute, I felt his gaze again. I couldn't help but glance back toward the window. He was still watching me, his face blank, his hands resting on the counter like he had nothing better to do than keep his eyes on me. The feeling in my stomach tightened. I told myself to relax. I was being paranoid. I had just been on edge from driving so long. But that didn't stop the small voice in the back of my head from telling me something was off. The pump clicked, signaling the tank was full. I hurried to replace the nozzle, but before I could get back in my car, I heard the door to the gas station open. I froze. "Hey," the attendant called out. His voice was low, rough, like he hadn't spoken much that day. I turned slowly, keeping my hand on the car door. He was standing on the threshold, leaning against the frame, still staring at me. His face looked even more unsettling up close, like there was something wrong with the way he smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "There's something wrong with your car," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. I blinked, my heart starting to pound harder. I hadn't noticed anything wrong with the car, but then again, I wasn't a mechanic. "What do you mean?" He nodded toward the hood. "I saw it when you pulled in. Looked like it was smoking a bit. You might want to pop the hood. Could be dangerous." I glanced back at my car. There hadn't been any smoke. No strange noises, no warning lights. Nothing. Everything had seemed perfectly fine when I pulled in. "I didn't see anything," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out shaky. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It's better to be safe, you know. I can take a quick look for you." Something in his tone sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't friendly. It was too insistent. Like he wasn't offering, he was telling me to let him check. "No, it's fine," I said quickly, taking a step toward my car. "I'm in a bit of a hurry, actually. I should get going." I reached for the door handle, but before I could open it, he moved. He was suddenly right in front of me, blocking my path. "You should really let me check the car," he said, his voice lowering. There was no smile now, just that blank look on his face, his eyes staring down at me. "It's not safe to drive like that." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I could feel the panic rising, but I didn't want to show it. I didn't want him to know I was scared. "I appreciate it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but really, I'm fine." He didn't move. He just stood there, too close, his eyes fixed on mine. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to let me go. My hand was still on the door handle, but I couldn't open it with him standing right there. "I'm just trying to help," he said finally, but there was something in his tone that made it sound more like a threat than an offer. "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "but I'm good." "Really?" He stayed there for a moment longer, and I could feel my heart racing, my palms sweating. Then, without saying another word, he took a step back. I didn't waste a second. I yanked the door open and slid into the driver's seat, locking the door as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, trying to get the engine started. I could see him still standing there, watching me through the windshield. His face was blank, but there was something in his eyes, something that made my skin crawl. The engine roared to life, and I didn't wait. I threw the car into drive and pulled out of the lot, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, in the same spot, just watching me go. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I don't know what his intentions were. Maybe he was trying to help. Maybe there really was something wrong with the car. But something about the way he looked at me, something about the way he insisted, made me feel like I had just narrowly avoided something terrible. I haven't been able to get that night out of my head. I keep thinking about how close he stood, how his eyes never left mine. And I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had let him check the car. I worked late that night, later than usual. By the time I left the office, the streets were almost empty, the sky dark, and the air cool enough that I could see my breath as I walked. My car was parked in the underground garage beneath the building, a few floors down. It was mostly empty by then. A few cars were still there, scattered in the dim light, but the place felt deserted. That kind of silence that made everything feel heavy, like the walls were closing in a little. I always hated parking garages, especially at night. The echoes of your own footsteps make you feel like you're never alone, like someone's always just behind you. But that night, I had no choice. I headed down the stairs instead of taking the elevator. It felt quicker. I just wanted to get to my car and go home. The stairwell was dim, the lights flickering slightly, and each step I took echoed off the concrete walls. When I finally stepped into the garage, I could hear my footsteps bouncing off the empty space. I was parked all the way in the back, farthest from the entrance, which I immediately regretted. It made sense in the morning when the lot was packed, but now it seemed like a mistake. I was about halfway to my car when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine, someone else's. The sound was distant at first, maybe from the other side of the garage. I paused, listening. The steps stopped. I stood there for a second, telling myself it was probably just someone else heading to their car, but my instincts were already kicking in. That tightening in my chest, that creeping sense that something wasn't right. I kept walking, trying to stay calm, but as I moved, the footsteps started again. They were closer this time, and they were matching my pace. I sped up a little, my heart pounding, and the steps quickened too. Every time I picked up speed, so did they. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see who it was. I just wanted to get to my car, get inside, and lock the door. My hand fumbled in my pocket for my keys, gripping them tightly as I walked faster. The sound of the footsteps got louder, more insistent. They weren't far behind me now. My breath was coming in short bursts, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I was almost at my car. Just a few more steps. I could see it, sitting there in the dim light, like a safe haven. I broke into a jog, the footsteps behind me doing the same. Whoever it was, they weren't just following me, they were chasing me. My hand shook as I pulled the keys from my pocket, fumbling to find the right one for the door. The footsteps were right behind me now, echoing so loudly in the empty garage that I couldn't tell how close they were. I could feel my skin crawl, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I reached my car and hit the button to unlock the doors. Just as I grabbed the handle, I felt it. A hand on my shoulder. Cold fingers digging into my jacket, pulling me back. I froze for a split second, my brain not processing what was happening. Then I reacted. I don't know how, but I whipped around, wrenching myself free from the grip. There was a man standing there, his face half hidden in the shadows, but I could see enough. His eyes were wide, unblinking, staring at me with this strange intensity. His mouth was half open like he was about to say something, but he didn't. He just kept staring at me, his hand still outstretched. I didn't wait. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me and hitting the lock button as hard as I could. My heart was racing, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I glanced up, and he was still standing there, right outside the driver's side window, watching me. His face was expressionless, but his eyes, there was something wrong with his eyes. Like he wasn't really seeing me, just looking through me. I started the car, the engine roaring to life. For a second, I thought he was going to try to break the window, to smash it and drag me out. He didn't move, though. He just kept staring. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed out of the space. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. He was still there, standing in the same spot, not moving. Just watching. I don't remember much of the drive home. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his face behind me, following me. But the road was empty. When I got home, I sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm down. My mind was racing, playing back the events in the garage over and over again. Who was that guy? Why was he following me? What did he want? I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that somehow he knew where I lived, that he was going to show up again. I checked the locks on all the doors that night, twice. I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made me jump, every creak of the house or rustle of the wind outside. I kept thinking about those footsteps, the way they had matched mine perfectly, the way he had grabbed me. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I couldn't. I called in sick and stayed home, locked inside, trying to tell myself I was safe. But I didn't feel safe. Not after that. I started parking closer to the entrance after that, never going down to the lower levels unless I absolutely had to. I tried not to think about it, tried to convince myself it was a random encounter, that I had just been unlucky. But the memory of that night stayed with me, the sound of those footsteps following me in the dark, the way his hand had felt on my shoulder. I never found out who he was or what he wanted. I never saw him again, either. But every time I go into a parking garage now, I feel that same creeping fear, like someone's watching me, like the echoes of my footsteps aren't the only ones. It was late when I left the mall. I had been there longer than I planned, just browsing through stores, buying a few things here and there, nothing big. By the time I stepped out, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The parking lot was mostly empty except for a few scattered cars and the usual flickering lights. I wasn't really worried. I parked close enough to the entrance, or at least I thought I had. I walked toward where I swore I left my car, but when I got there, it wasn't. I stood there, looking around for a second, thinking maybe I had just misremembered the spot. It happens sometimes when you're distracted. So I started walking up and down the rows, clicking my key fob, waiting to hear the familiar beep of my car unlocking. Nothing. I went up a few more rows, then back down, growing more confused by the second. I knew I'd parked near that light pole. I even remembered mentally marking it when I walked in. But there was no sign of my car. Not even a similar one parked nearby. I started feeling uneasy, a knot forming in my stomach. I must have circled the area 3 or 4 times, each lap making me feel more foolish and panicked. It wasn't there. My car was gone. It didn't make sense, though. I didn't think anyone would steal it. It was just an older sedan, nothing special or flashy. I hadn't seen any broken glass or signs of a break-in either. I was about to head back inside to see if there was a security office when I heard someone behind me. "Hey, excuse me." I turned around, and there was a man walking toward me. He was maybe in his mid-30s, dressed in a plain jacket, hands stuffed in his pockets. He had this weird half-smile on his face, one of those smiles that doesn't quite reach the eyes. "You looking for a car?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should respond, but then I nodded. "Yeah, I can't seem to find it. I'm sure I parked right here." He tilted his head, like he was thinking. "I think I saw it get towed." That stopped me. "Towed? Why?" He shrugged. "Not sure. Saw a tow truck pull up a while ago, and they took off with the car. Could have been yours." I stared at him, my heart sinking. That doesn't make any sense. I wasn't parked illegally. And they usually leave a notice or something, right? He shrugged again, this casual, careless gesture that made me uneasy. Maybe they didn't bother. You know how these places can be. I didn't respond right away. Something about his demeanor didn't sit right with me. There was something off, something about the way he was standing too close or how he kept glancing around the lot. "You need a ride?" he asked, a little too quickly. "I'm heading out now. I can drop you somewhere, help you out." I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. I shook my head. "No, it's fine. I'll just call someone." He didn't move. Didn't back off, just stood there with that same off-putting smile. "You sure? It's no trouble. You shouldn't be out here alone this late. You never know what kind of people are hanging around." The way he said that last part made my skin crawl. I took a step back, trying to keep calm, trying not to let him see that I was starting to panic. "No, thanks. Really. I'll just go back inside, maybe ask someone at the mall." He stepped toward me, closing the distance I had just made. "Come on. It's quicker if I just take you." I saw the tow truck leave. It was heading toward that main road. "I can catch up to it." Something in his voice had shifted. It was still calm, but there was an edge to it now. He was pushing too hard. I could feel my pulse quickening, that instinctual fear starting to rise. I needed to get away from him. I glanced toward the mall entrance. It was farther than I wanted it to be, but I didn't have many options. My phone was in my bag, but pulling it out in front of him felt risky. I needed to think clearly, but my thoughts were racing. "I'm fine," I said, more firmly this time. "I'm going to go back inside now." I turned to walk away, keeping my pace steady, trying not to look like I was running even though every part of me was screaming to. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps quickening to match mine. "Hey!" His voice was louder now, more insistent. "I'm just trying to help you out." I didn't respond. I kept moving, focusing on the door, on getting inside where there were people. I could hear his footsteps getting closer, his breathing too. He was following me. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I knew I needed to move faster. "Hey!" His voice was right behind me now, and I felt his hand brush my arm. I yanked away, breaking into a full sprint. I didn't care about appearances anymore. I just needed to get away from him. I heard him curse under his breath, his footsteps thundering behind me as he tried to keep up. The glass doors of the mall were just ahead, and I threw myself toward them, pushing through, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst inside and immediately headed for the nearest group of people, a small cluster near the food court. I glanced behind me. The man had stopped at the doors, standing just outside, his eyes locked on me through the glass. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was dark, his face twisted in frustration, maybe even anger. He stood there for a moment, staring at me, and I could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back into the parking lot, disappearing into the shadows between the cars. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking as I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. I called a friend to pick me up, not trusting myself to go back out into that parking lot alone. When my friend arrived, I had mall security walk me out. They checked the area, but the man was gone, and so was my car. It wasn't until later, when I filed a police report, that I found out my car hadn't been towed at all. It had been stolen. The man had lied. I don't know why. Maybe he was working with whoever took it, or maybe he had something else in mind for me. I don't want to think about what would have happened if I had gotten into his car that night. I never saw him again, but I can't shake the feeling that he wasn't just some random guy in the parking lot. He had been waiting, watching. And I had almost fallen for it. I've always liked running late at night. It's peaceful, you know? The streets are quiet, the park's usually empty, and there's something about the dark that makes me feel like I've got the whole world to myself. I know some people find it weird, maybe even risky, but I've never felt unsafe. I run the same route every night. There's a path that cuts through the park that I've been taking for years. It's well lit for the most part, except for one stretch where the lights are a bit dim, but it's never bothered me. That night started out the same as any other. I laced up my shoes, left my apartment, and hit the pavement. The air was crisp, a little colder than usual, but it felt good. I had my headphones in, listening to some music to keep my pace steady. I usually run for about an hour, and I always look forward to that time of night when it feels like the city's asleep. I was about halfway through my usual route when I reached the park. The first part of the path is near the entrance, and it's always well lit. I've never seen many people there that late, maybe a dog walker or someone else jogging, but mostly, it's quiet. That's why it caught me off guard when I noticed someone behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's a public park, after all, and other people use it too. But I couldn't help but feel a little strange about it. I couldn't hear their footsteps at first because of the music in my ears, but when I glanced back, there was definitely someone a few meters behind me, jogging at a steady pace. Something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the fact that it was so late or the way they stayed right in line with me, like they were intentionally keeping the same distance. I shook it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe they were just another runner, keeping to their own pace. But as I kept going, I noticed something that really started to freak me out. Whenever I sped up a little, so did they. I tested it a few times, pushing my pace just to see what would happen, and each time, they matched me. It wasn't like they were gaining on me or falling behind. They were just there, always the same distance, always keeping up. I couldn't see their face, just a dark figure in the corner of my eye whenever I glanced back. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they didn't even realize they were matching my pace. Maybe they were just lost in their own thoughts, focused on their own run. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something felt off. There was no sound of heavy breathing, no tiredness in their steps. It was like they weren't even breaking a sweat. I reached the darker part of the path, where the lights are spaced out further apart, casting long shadows on the ground. That's when my heart started racing for real. I thought about turning around, but the idea of passing them freaked me out more than just keeping my pace. I figured if I could just keep going, they'd either stop or take a different path. But they didn't. As we moved further into the darker section, I noticed that the footsteps weren't just behind me anymore. They were closer, too close. Whoever was back there had shortened the gap between us without me realizing. It didn't feel like they were just running anymore. It felt like they were following me. I pulled my headphones out, listening carefully to the sound of their footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate, and each one seemed to echo in the empty park. I sped up again, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs starting to burn from the sudden push. I didn't dare look back this time. I didn't want to see how close they were. The path curved ahead, leading back toward the better lit area near the exit. If I could just get to that part, I thought I'd be fine. I could see the street lights up ahead, and I focused on them, forcing myself to keep running, pushing harder than I usually do. But the footsteps behind me didn't let up. In fact, they were even closer now, right on my heels. My chest tightened with panic, and I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. I could feel them, whoever they were, just a few feet behind me, almost as if they could reach out and grab me. I made a split-second decision. Instead of following the curve of the path, I darted off to the side, cutting across the grass toward the park exit. My feet stumbled over uneven ground, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I ran as fast as I could, my legs screaming, my breath coming in ragged gasps. For a second, it felt like I'd lost them. The footsteps behind me stopped, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. But just as I reached the edge of the park, I heard it again, those heavy, deliberate footsteps, still following, still matching my pace. They hadn't stopped at all. I glanced back, just for a second, and saw a figure in the distance, still running toward me, not slowing down. I couldn't make out any details in the dark, but they were tall, broad, and moving with purpose. I burst out of the park and onto the sidewalk, not stopping, not daring to look back again. I didn't care about the burning in my lungs or the stitch in my side. I just ran, faster than I ever had before, until I reached the main road, where the streetlights were bright and the occasional car drove past. I slowed down, gasping for breath, and finally dared to look back. The figure was gone. The park was quiet, the path empty. It was like they had vanished into thin air, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew someone had been following me, someone who had stayed right behind me the entire time. I walked the rest of the way home, my legs shaking, looking over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see that figure again. But I never did. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed on the couch, my body still trembling with adrenaline. I didn't run the next night, or the night after that. In fact, I stopped running at night altogether. Maybe it was just some weirdo trying to mess with me, or maybe it was something worse. I don't know. But I'll never forget the sound of those footsteps, always right behind me, always matching my pace. Whoever they weren't just another runner. They were following me. I was driving cross-country, trying to make it as far as I could in one day. I hadn't planned on stopping, but after hours on the road, I needed to rest. It was getting late, and I was too tired to keep going, so I pulled off the highway when I saw a sign for a motel. It wasn't anything special, just one of those cheap places you see along the side of the road, but I didn't care. I just needed a place to crash for a few hours. The parking lot was nearly empty, which made sense since it was a weekday and the place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. The neon sign flickered, and the whole area had a strange, rundown vibe, but again, I was too tired to think much about it. I grabbed my bag and checked in at the front desk. The guy working there barely looked up when I walked in. He slid the key across the counter and mumbled something about checkout being at 11. The room was about what I expected: old carpet, a sagging bed, and that stale motel smell. I double-checked the lock on the door, flipped the deadbolt, and threw my bag on the chair in the corner. After a quick shower, I crawled into bed and turned on the TV for a little background noise. It was quiet, too quiet, and the place had this weird, lonely feel. I didn't like it, but I figured it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly because the next thing I remember, I woke up to a noise. At first, I couldn't place it. My mind was foggy from sleep, but then I heard it again. Someone was jiggling the door handle. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, a soft rattling sound like someone was trying to turn the knob slowly. I sat up in bed, my heart already racing, and strained to listen. There it was again, another jiggle, this time a bit more forceful. I felt my stomach drop. I knew I had locked the door. I double-checked it. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and looked at the time. It was just after 2 a.m. My first thought was maybe it was someone who had the wrong room. People make mistakes, especially at places like this, but something about the way the handle was moving didn't feel like a mistake. It felt deliberate. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, waiting to see if it would stop. But it didn't. The jiggling continued, slow and careful, like whoever was out there didn't want to be heard. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears as I tried to figure out what to do. The front desk, maybe I should call the front desk. I dialed the number, my hands shaking a little, and waited for someone to pick up. After what felt like forever, the same guy who checked me in answered. I kept my voice low, trying not to sound too panicked, and told him someone was trying to get into my room. "There shouldn't be anyone outside," he said, sounding more bored than concerned. I told him again that I could hear someone messing with my door handle, and this time, he sighed, like I was bothering him. He said he'd checked the security cameras, but then he just hung up. No reassurance, no offer to come check it out, just click. I stared at the phone, feeling a mix of anger and fear, not knowing what to do next. That's when I heard it, the door handle turned. My body went cold. I knew I had locked the door, but now, whoever was out there wasn't just jiggling the handle. They were trying to open the door. I could hear the faint creak of the metal as it twisted, like they were testing how much force it would take to get inside. I jumped out of bed and ran to the door, pressing my body against it as if my weight could keep them out. I didn't know what else to do, so I yelled through the door, trying to sound brave. "Whoever you are, you need to leave." There was no response. The handle stopped moving for a second, and I thought maybe they'd gone. But then, I heard a faint scrape, like something metal sliding against the door. A key. They were trying to pick the lock. Panic flooded my chest, and I backed away from the door, my heart hammering. I grabbed my phone again and called the front desk, this time almost screaming into the phone that someone was trying to break into my room. The guy sighed again, like I was being dramatic. "Ma'am, no one should be out there." I checked the cameras. It's probably just a mistake. A mistake? How could he think this was a mistake? I could hear the metal scraping against the lock, someone actively trying to get into my room, and he thought it was nothing? I slammed the phone down and ran to the window. The curtains were drawn, but I peeked through a small gap, trying to see if I could catch a glimpse of who was outside. The parking lot was still empty, no cars pulling in or out, just a dim glow of the neon sign flickering in the distance. But then I saw it, just below my window, a shadow moving. Someone was there. They were crouched low, trying to stay out of sight, but I could see the faint outline of a figure, the way they were positioned like they were hiding. My breath caught in my throat. I was trapped. If they got in, there was nowhere for me to go. I pressed my back against the wall, my mind racing. Should I run? Should I try to barricade the door? But then the scraping stopped, and everything went quiet again. Too quiet. For a few minutes, I didn't move. I just stood there, waiting, listening for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, the hum of the TV in the background. I almost convinced myself that it was over, that maybe they'd given up and left. But just as I started to relax, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of a key turning in the lock. I didn't think. I ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. I grabbed the only weapon I could find, a flimsy little towel rack, and stood there, my heart pounding out of my chest. I could hear the door to the room creak open, the sound of footsteps on the old carpet. They were inside. I held my breath, gripping the towel rack like it would somehow protect me. The footsteps were slow, methodical, like whoever was in my room was taking their time, searching, looking for something or someone. I could hear them moving around, checking the closet, the bed, the chair where I tossed my bag. Then they stopped. Right outside the bathroom door. I felt like I was going to pass out. I could hear them breathing on the other side of the door, just standing there, waiting. I held the towel rack tighter, ready to swing if they tried to come in. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed like that, me on one side of the door, them on the other. But then, slowly, the footsteps started again, moving away from the bathroom. I heard the door to the room open, the faint creak of the hinges, and then, silence. I stayed in the bathroom for another hour, too terrified to come out. Eventually, I worked up the courage to unlock the door and peek into the room. It was empty. The door to the hallway was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze from the AC. I didn't wait to see if they'd come back. I grabbed my things and bolted. The guy at the front desk didn't even look up when I threw the key on the counter and ran out to my car. I drove for hours, not stopping until the sun came up, my hands shaking the whole time. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I'll never forget the sound of that key turning in the lock. Whoever it was, they had a way in. I don't usually stay up late, but that night I had fallen asleep on the couch while watching TV. It was around midnight when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I live alone in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so it caught me off guard. I remember feeling this sudden jolt of unease, like something was off. It wasn't like the doorbell rang during normal hours when you might expect a delivery or someone stopping by. I sat up and listened for a second, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Then it rang again, this time a bit longer. I grabbed my phone and opened the app for my security camera. I've got a small camera just above the front door, and it usually shows anyone coming up the steps. When I checked the feed, the porch was empty. No one was there. I stared at the screen for a while, confused. I thought maybe it was a glitch, or maybe someone rang the bell and ran off, but it didn't make sense. There was no movement, no sign of anyone. I watched the screen for a few more seconds before deciding to ignore it. If it was a prank, it wasn't worth losing sleep over. But then the doorbell rang again. This time it was quicker, like whoever was out there was impatient. I opened the app again, nothing. The porch was still empty, and there were no notifications of movement from the camera either. My heart started beating a little faster because now I knew something wasn't right. I got up from the couch and walked over to the front door, moving quietly like I didn't want whoever it was to hear me. I leaned in close to the peephole and glanced outside. No one. It was pitch dark, except for the faint glow from the street lamp down the block. I was starting to feel really uneasy by then. It wasn't just the bell ringing, it was the fact that the camera didn't pick up anything at all. The doorbell rang again, but this time it was followed by a soft knock, 2 gentle taps. I froze. Whoever it was, they were definitely still there, but somehow invisible to the camera. I hesitated for a moment, considering my options. I could ignore it and hope they'd leave, or I could open the door, but I wasn't about to do that. Instead, I decided to wait it out. Maybe they'd get bored and leave. But they didn't. The knocking started again, more persistent this time, and then there was a faint whisper. I couldn't make out the words at first, so I leaned my ear against the door, trying to hear better. It was a man's voice, low and raspy. "I know you're in there." My heart nearly stopped. The voice was so close, like whoever it was had their mouth right up against the door. I backed away, stumbling over the edge of the rug. I couldn't understand how someone could be standing outside, so close, and still not show up on the camera. The whispering continued, and it was getting more aggressive. "Open the door. I saw you. I know you're in there." I grabbed my phone again, checking the camera feed, but it was still showing an empty porch. My hands were shaking now. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to call the police because, at that point, it just seemed like someone playing a cruel prank. But then the knocking turned into pounding, heavy, violent thuds. The door rattled on its hinges like whoever it was trying to break it down. "Open the door." The voice wasn't whispering anymore. It was shouting now, demanding to be let in. I panicked. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed a knife, not knowing what else to do. I stood there, gripping the handle so hard my knuckles turned white. I couldn't think straight, and the pounding on the door wouldn't stop. The guy on the other side was screaming now, saying things I couldn't fully understand, but I caught bits and pieces, threats, violent things. He knew I was inside, and he wasn't going away. My mind was racing. Should I call the police? Should I try to scare him off? The pounding got louder, and then I heard scratching. Like nails or something sharp dragging across the wood. I couldn't stay frozen any longer. I ran back to the front door, stood just inches from it, and yelled, "Go away. I'm calling the cops." Silence. Everything went quiet. No more pounding, no more scratching, just dead silence. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. I checked the camera feed again, but still, no one was there. My whole body was shaking. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me, my chest tight with fear. I stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Slowly, I began to think maybe he'd finally left. I couldn't hear anything outside, and there were no more sounds at the door. I put the knife down on the table and took a deep breath, trying to calm down. But then, the doorbell rang one last time. I froze. My mind went blank, and all I could do was stare at the door. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I could handle hearing that voice again. But I had to check. I opened the camera app one more time, hoping I'd see an empty porch again, but this time was different. There was a man standing there, staring directly into the camera. His face was pale, almost ghostly, but it wasn't a ghost. This was a person, a real person. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and his mouth was twisted into a sick smile. He stood there, perfectly still, not moving, just staring at the camera, as if he knew I was watching. My stomach dropped. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This whole time, he'd been invisible to the camera, and now, suddenly, he was right there, staring at me through the screen. I backed away from the door, too scared to even think about what I should do next. The guy didn't move. He just stood there, smiling, like he was enjoying this. Then, without warning, he raised his hand and pointed at the door. His smile widened, and his mouth moved, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. I didn't want to hear it. I ran to the back of the house, locking myself in the bathroom. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, and I could barely get the words out. I told them someone was outside my house, pounding on the door and whispering threats. They said they were sending someone, but it would take a few minutes for the nearest patrol to arrive. I sat on the floor of the bathroom, clutching my phone, trying to stay quiet. I didn't hear any more knocking, but I was too scared to leave the room. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. I crept out of the bathroom and looked out the window, seeing the red and blue lights flashing in the driveway. When the police knocked on the door, I almost didn't open it. I was so shaken that I couldn't think straight. But eventually, I unlocked the door and let them in. I told them everything about the doorbell ringing, the threats, the pounding on the door, and how the man had finally shown up on the camera. They checked the area around the house, but they didn't find anyone. No sign of the man, no footprints, nothing. The officer looked at the camera footage, but by the time they got there, it was blank. The recording cut out right before the man had appeared on the screen. I had no proof of what I saw, no evidence that he was ever there. The police told me they'd patrol the area for the rest of the night and that I should call if anything else happened. I thanked them, but deep down, I knew they wouldn't find him. Whoever that man was, he knew how to avoid being caught. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the living room, staring at the door, waiting for the next ring of the bell. I've never been one to stay out late, but that night was different. I had a long day and couldn't sleep, so I decided to go to a 24-hour diner not far from my apartment. I'd been there a few times before, always late, and it was usually quiet. I liked the idea of sitting alone in a booth, with a cup of coffee and maybe some pancakes, where no one would bother me. Just some time to clear my head. It was around 1 a.m. when I walked in. The diner was pretty much empty, just the waitress leaning on the counter, flipping through a magazine, and some guy in the back corner, hunched over his food. I didn't pay him much attention at first. I found a booth by the window, sat down, and ordered some coffee. The place felt safe. I could see my car parked right outside, and there was something comforting about the neon lights from the sign shining through the window. Everything felt normal for the first half hour or so. I sipped my coffee, scrolled through my phone, and watched as the waitress went about her business, refilling the ketchup bottles and wiping down the counter. But then I noticed him. The man in the corner. At first, it was just a feeling like you know when someone's watching you, even though you're not looking at them. I glanced up, and sure enough, he was staring at me. Not in a casual way either. His eyes were locked on me, unblinking, and it was like he didn't care that I caught him. He was a big guy, probably in his late 40s or early 50s, with messy hair and a worn-out jacket. His face was pale, like he hadn't seen the sun in a long time, and there was this strange look on his face, like he was studying me. I tried to ignore it at first. Maybe he was just some lonely guy, sitting there, lost in thought. But every time I looked up, his eyes were still on me. I didn't know what to do. I thought about leaving, but I hadn't finished my coffee yet, and I didn't want to seem paranoid. So, I stayed, trying to focus on my phone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced up again, and this time, I noticed he had pushed his plate aside, like he was done eating, but he wasn't leaving. He just sat there, watching me. I started to feel trapped. It was just me, the waitress, and him. The waitress hadn't noticed anything. She was still by the counter, now talking to the cook in the back. I didn't want to cause a scene, but I couldn't stay there any longer. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and walked to the counter to pay my bill. As I handed over the money, I could feel his eyes burning into the back of my head. I didn't look back. I thanked the waitress and quickly walked to the door. My heart was starting to race, but I told myself it was just in my head. Maybe he was just some weird guy, nothing more. But as soon as I stepped outside, I heard the door to the diner open behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and there he was, standing just a few feet away, looking right at me. He wasn't trying to be subtle about it either. He was following me. My car was only a few steps away, but my hands were shaking as I reached into my bag to get my keys. I fumbled with them for what felt like forever before finally getting a grip. I could hear his footsteps behind me, slow but steady, like he wasn't in a rush, but he wasn't about to let me get away either. I tried to stay calm, telling myself to just get to the car, lock the doors, and drive away. But as I started walking faster, so did he. I could hear his heavy breathing now, and it sent a wave of panic through me. I knew I couldn't let him catch up. I broke into a run, sprinting the last few feet to my car. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps getting louder and faster. I reached my car, yanked the door open, and slammed it shut, locking it just as he reached the window. He was right there. His face was inches from the glass, staring at me with this twisted grin, like he was enjoying the whole thing. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I could see his lips moving. He was mouthing something over and over again, but I didn't want to know what it was. I fumbled to get the keys in the ignition, my hands shaking so bad I almost dropped them. When the engine finally started, I didn't waste any time. I threw the car into reverse and backed out of the parking lot as fast as I could. He was still standing there, watching me, not moving, just smiling. I drove down the empty streets, my heart racing, trying to figure out what just happened. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him following me in some old beat-up car, but the road behind me was empty. I didn't slow down until I was a good 10 minutes away from the diner, and even then, I couldn't stop shaking. When I finally got home, I sat in the car for a few minutes, just trying to catch my breath. I couldn't believe how close he had been, how easily he could have grabbed me if I hadn't gotten to my car in time. I kept replaying it in my head, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't run. I didn't tell anyone about it for a while. I didn't even know how to explain it without sounding crazy. Who goes to a diner in the middle of the night and gets followed by some creepy guy? It sounds like something out of a movie, but it was real. Too real. For weeks after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for another chance. I stopped going out at night, and when I did, I was always looking over my shoulder, checking my surroundings, making sure no one was following me. I don't go to that diner anymore. I don't think I ever will. Every time I drive past it, I can't help but think of that man standing outside, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. It was a quiet night when I noticed the lights flickering in my elderly neighbor's house. It was well past midnight, and the streets were empty. The glow from her living room windows was strange and erratic, casting shadows on the ground outside. I had lived next to Mrs. Ellis for several years, and I knew her routine. She rarely stayed up late, often going to bed shortly after the sun set. The sight of those lights stirred a sense of unease in me. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just having trouble with her lamp or something. Still, curiosity gnawed at me, and I found myself peering through my window to get a better look. The glow pulsed and changed, and that's when I heard it, a faint sound drifting through the cool night air. At first, I couldn't make it out, but as I strained to listen, it became clear that it was muffled voices. The mix of light and noise tugged at my instincts. Something felt very wrong. I glanced back at my own dark living room and decided that I could not ignore it. I slipped on my shoes, grabbed my phone, and made my way out of my house, the cool night air biting at my skin. As I approached her front porch, the lights shifted again, now a blend of orange and yellow, almost like a small fire. It was strange. I didn't remember her mentioning anything about guests coming over. She had always seemed somewhat reserved, keeping to herself and rarely inviting anyone over. I stepped up to her front door, noticing that it was slightly ajar. My heart raced, pounding in my chest. I knocked gently, half expecting her to open it with a smile and explain what was happening. No answer. The muffled sounds continued from inside, a jumble of low voices I couldn't quite decipher. "Mrs. Ellis?" I called out softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you in there?" Silence. The voices faded, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something wasn't right. I hesitated, but curiosity propelled me to push the door open a bit wider. It creaked on its hinges, and I peeked inside. The living room was lit with several lamps, but the light seemed different, more chaotic. I could see shadows dancing across the walls. "Mrs. Ellis?" I called again, stepping just inside the threshold. The air felt thick, and the strange sense of smoke and something else, something sharp, filled my nose. I felt uneasy. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I stepped farther in. I could hear the voices now, a mix of low murmurs and occasional bursts of laughter. It struck me as odd. I knew her voice well, it was unmistakable. Yet, there were others in the house, too, and I had no idea who they were. I called out her name one more time. "Mrs. Ellis." "Shoo," came a voice from deeper in the house, muffled and almost frantic. "Keep it down." That voice wasn't Mrs. Ellis. The hairs on my arms stood up. I crept further inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The living room looked normal enough, pictures of her family lined the walls, her favorite chair sat by the window. But the kitchen door was open just a crack, and the lights were brighter there. Taking a breath, I pushed the kitchen door slightly, peering through the gap. The scene inside was like something out of a nightmare. There were 3 men crowded around the table, leaning over something that I couldn't see. The air was tense, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. One of them was the same man I had seen in her yard a few times, but I didn't know the other 2. "Did you hear that?" one of them whispered sharply. My heart raced. They were talking about me, but they couldn't see me yet. I stepped back, my mind racing. Should I run? Should I call the police? The thought of being caught here paralyzed me for a moment. Then I remembered my phone. I needed to get it out and call for help. But just as I turned to quietly back away, I knocked over a small potted plant sitting on the side table. It crashed to the ground, the sound ringing loudly in the silence. "Who's there?" a voice yelled, deep and menacing. I froze. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the door, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I could hear footsteps pounding behind me. I burst through the front door, not looking back. My heart pounded in my ears as I sprinted toward my house, not caring if they saw me. I dove through my front door and locked it behind me, gasping for air. I fumbled for my phone, my hand shaking. I dialed 911, my voice shaky as I explained the situation, telling them there might be an intruder in Mrs. Ellis's home. They assured me help was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours as I watched the windows, terrified they would come for me next. As I waited, I heard sirens approaching, my heart sinking a little with relief. I rushed to the window to see flashing lights reflecting off the walls of my living room. I watched as police cars pulled up in front of Mrs. Ellis's house. They jumped out, rushing to the door. I held my breath, praying they would find her safe. After what felt like an eternity, I saw them lead her out. She looked shaken but unharmed. The three men were handcuffed and being taken away. I could hear bits of the conversation through the open window. They had been trying to pressure her into handing over money for something she knew nothing about. Mrs. Ellis turned to the officers, her face pale but grateful. They escorted her to a nearby police car, and I could see her shaking. She had no idea what had just happened. Once they finished, I opened my door, stepping outside to approach her. She turned and saw me. Her eyes were wide, filled with a mix of fear and confusion. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Yes," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. "I am so thankful you checked on me. I thought I was done for." The police took our statements, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The officers assured us that she was safe now, and I watched as they led the men away. After they left, I helped Mrs. Ellis clean up her living room. We sat together, and I listened as she recounted the terrifying moments when they had barged in, demanding money and making threats. She had been too frightened to scream, too shocked to think of escaping. That night changed everything. I became more vigilant about my surroundings and made sure to check on Mrs. Ellis regularly. What I witnessed taught me that sometimes it takes just a flicker of light to reveal the darkness lurking beneath the surface. I was thankful I had been there that night, thankful for the strange lights and muffled voices that led me to her door. I had a late shift at work that night. By the time I got out of the office, the streets were already quiet, and there was a slight chill in the air. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself and walked to the subway, my mind wandering as I thought about what I needed to do the next day. It was one of those nights where everything felt a little off, but I was tired and just wanted to get home. The subway ride was uneventful, and I barely paid attention to the other passengers. I kept my head down, listening to music, counting the stops until I reached mine. When I finally stepped out into the cool air, I felt a bit of relief. It was only a short walk from the station to my apartment building, and I was looking forward to being home. When I reached the building, the lobby was empty, just the usual dim lighting and soft hum of the air conditioner. I hit the button for the elevator and waited. It felt like it was taking forever, and I remember staring at the floor, absent-mindedly tapping my foot. The elevator doors finally slid open, and that's when I noticed him. A man was already inside, standing in the corner. He wasn't doing anything, just staring straight ahead. I hesitated for a moment but stepped inside. It's a small building, and I figured he must have been one of the new tenants. Maybe I hadn't seen him before. He looked normal enough. Mid-30s, short hair, wearing a plain jacket and jeans. Nothing that stood out, but as soon as I pressed the button for my floor, I noticed something strange. He didn't press any button for his. He just stood there. The elevator doors closed, and we started to move. I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't want to look over, so I kept my gaze fixed on the elevator buttons. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Maybe he'd already pressed his floor, and I hadn't noticed. "You live here long?" he asked suddenly. I glanced at him, startled. His voice was low, casual, but there was something about the way he spoke that set me on edge. I didn't want to engage in a conversation, especially not this late at night with a stranger in a cramped elevator. "Yeah, a little while," I replied quickly, hoping that would end it. He nodded but kept looking at me. "It's a quiet building," he said. "I just moved in a few weeks ago." I nodded, not really wanting to continue talking, but he wasn't finished. "You live alone?" he asked. My stomach clenched. That was not a normal question to ask someone you just met. I tried to keep my face neutral, not wanting to show any signs of discomfort. "No," I lied. "I live with my boyfriend." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That's good. It's always safer when you're not alone." I forced a weak laugh, hoping that would be the end of it. I just needed to get to my floor and get out of there. The elevator felt like it was moving slower than usual. I could feel the tension building in the small space, and I was suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet it was. We passed the 5th floor, then the 6th. My heart was pounding by the time we neared the 7th, where I lived. I prayed he wouldn't follow me, that he would stay in the elevator or get off at some random floor. When the doors finally slid open on my floor, I stepped out quickly, muttering a good night under my breath. But as I turned to head down the hallway, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't want to look, but I could feel him close, just a few steps behind. "I'm visiting someone here," he said casually. "A friend of mine just moved in." I didn't respond. My mind was racing, trying to think of what to do. I had never seen anyone moving in recently, no new faces, no boxes being carried up or down. I knew almost everyone on this floor, and something about his tone made my skin crawl. I walked faster, hoping he would stop, but his footsteps matched mine. My apartment was at the end of the hall, and I was trying to figure out what to do. Should I walk past my door? Pretend I wasn't going home yet? I didn't want him to know where I lived, but I also didn't want to keep walking down this empty hallway with him. I stopped in front of my door, my hand shaking slightly as I reached for my keys. He stopped too, standing a little too close, watching me. I could feel his eyes on my back. "Which apartment are you visiting?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though my voice came out shaky. "Oh, it's just a few doors down," he said. "Can't remember the number right now." I didn't say anything. I just fumbled with my keys, my heart racing. I needed to get inside. I needed to lock the door behind me. My hands were shaking so much that it took me longer than usual to unlock the door. The hallway felt like it was closing in on me, the air thick and suffocating. As soon as the lock clicked, I pushed the door open and stepped inside, turning to close it quickly. But he moved closer, his hand reaching out to stop the door. "Hey, can I use your bathroom real quick?" he asked, his voice calm, like it was a perfectly normal request. "No," I said, trying to push the door closed. "I'm sorry, I can't." He smiled again, that same unsettling smile, and for a moment, I thought he was going to force his way in. I was ready to scream, ready to fight if I had to. But then, he stepped back, letting the door close. I slammed it shut, locking it with shaking hands. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, listening. I didn't hear anything on the other side of the door. No footsteps, no movement. I ran to the peephole and looked out. He was standing there, staring at my door, not moving. Just standing there. I backed away, terrified that he might try to break in. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building security, explaining what had just happened. They said they would send someone up to check it out. I waited by the door, listening for any sound. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard footsteps again. I looked through the peephole and saw the security guard walking down the hallway, but the man was gone. I don't know where he went. I never saw him again after that night. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. I've since moved out of that building, but the fear still lingers. Every time I get into an elevator or walk down an empty hallway, I think about that man and how close he was to stepping into my apartment. It was late, somewhere around 11, maybe closer to midnight. I'd been driving for hours, just wanting to get home after a long day. My phone battery was dead, so I couldn't rely on GPS anymore, but I'd driven this stretch of road before, so I wasn't worried. The road was long, mostly empty, and pitch black aside from my headlights cutting through the darkness. I hadn't passed another car in what felt like an eternity. Just miles of barren land on either side and nothing but silence inside the car. I saw the gas station sign a little ways up, the kind you only see out in the middle of nowhere. It was dimly lit and looked like it had seen better days, but I needed gas. I'd been driving on fumes for the last 20 minutes, so I pulled in. The station was one of those older ones, no bright neon signs, just a flickering light above the pumps, the kind that gave off a soft buzzing noise. There was no one around. The small building, which I guessed was the office, looked shut down for the night. I figured it was one of those 24-hour places that only had self-service after a certain hour. I got out of the car, and that's when I noticed how quiet it was. Dead quiet. No crickets, no wind, just the hum of the fluorescent light overhead. I started pumping the gas, glancing around every now and then, feeling on edge for some reason I couldn't explain. While the tank filled, I stretched my legs and walked a few paces away from the car. That's when I saw something, or rather, someone. There was a shadow near the edge of the station, just beyond where the light could reach. It looked like a person, standing near the corner of the building. I could barely make them out, just a silhouette really, but they were definitely watching me. I stared back, waiting for them to move or say something. Nothing. They didn't shift, didn't even flinch. Just stood there, half hidden in the darkness. I told myself it was probably just someone passing through, maybe a homeless guy or something, but the way they stayed so still was unsettling. I turned back to the car, trying not to make it obvious that I'd noticed them, and pulled the nozzle out of the tank. The feeling in my gut was getting worse, like that prickling sensation you get when you know someone's eyes are on you. I put the gas cap back on and slid into the driver's seat, locking the doors out of habit. Before starting the engine, I looked up again. The figure was still there, but now they were standing a little closer, just a few steps forward, like they had inched out of the shadows. That was enough for me. I turned the key in the ignition and started to pull away from the pump. As I rolled out of the station, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure hadn't moved from where they were standing, just staring after me as I drove off. I thought that would be the end of it. Just a weird encounter in the middle of nowhere, right? But about a mile down the road, my eyes drifted to the mirror again. There was a car behind me, its headlights distant but unmistakable. I hadn't seen anyone else at the station, and there weren't any other cars on the road when I left. The shadowy figure had been the only one around, so where had this car come from? The road stretched out long and empty ahead of me, no signs, no buildings, just blackness. The car behind me kept its distance, never getting closer, but never falling back either. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe it was just another late-night driver, but that nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. Something felt off. I picked up speed, but the car stayed right with me, maintaining the same distance, not overtaking me or falling behind. My mind was racing now, running through possibilities. Maybe they were just heading the same way as me. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But what if it wasn't? I sped up more, pushing past the speed limit, hoping to lose them. But every time I checked the mirror, they were still there. Not gaining on me, just keeping that same unnerving distance. It was like they were toying with me, letting me know they were there but not making any real move. The headlights looked like two pinpoints of light in the dark, always behind me. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel. I started looking for an exit, any sign that would take me off this road and away from the car behind me. But there was nothing. Just miles and miles of empty highway, no other cars, no buildings, no turn-offs. I was stuck on this road with them. After what felt like an eternity, I saw a sign up ahead for a rest stop. It wasn't much, just a small turn-off with a couple of benches and a bathroom, but it was something. I thought maybe if I pulled in, the car would keep going, pass me by and disappear. I had to try something. I put my blinker on and slowed down as I approached the rest stop. The car behind me slowed too. My heart was pounding in my chest as I turned off the road and pulled into the small parking area. I parked and killed the engine, keeping my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. The car that had been following me didn't pass by. It turned in after me, pulling into the lot a few spaces away. I sat there, not moving, watching the car in the mirror. They didn't get out. The engine stayed running, headlights on, aimed straight at me. I could feel my pulse in my throat, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I started the car again, hands shaking. As soon as I put it in gear and pulled out of the rest stop, the car followed. This time, it was closer. Too close. The headlights were bright in my mirror, almost blinding. I sped up again, heart racing, but the car stuck right behind me, tailgating now, making no effort to hide what they were doing. I was in full panic mode, adrenaline pumping through me. I had to lose them. I swerved between lanes, trying to shake them, but they stayed right on my tail, relentless. I could see their headlights flashing in the mirror, getting closer and closer. I started honking my horn, hoping someone would hear me, but there was no one around. Just the empty road and this car that wouldn't leave me alone. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. Finally, up ahead, I saw an off-ramp. I didn't even check where it was leading, I just took it, hoping to lose the car in the twists and turns of the exit. But they followed, sticking to me like glue. My tires screeched as I took the curve too fast, barely keeping control, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The off-ramp led me to a smaller road, lined with trees on either side. There were no streetlights, just the occasional flash of my high beams reflecting off the trees. The car was still behind me, headlights bouncing as they followed me down the bumpy road. I thought I was done for. I couldn't outrun them, and there was nowhere to hide. But then, in the distance, I saw lights. A small diner, open late, with a few cars parked out front. It was the only sign of life I'd seen for miles. I floored it, heading straight for the diner. As I pulled into the lot, I slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car, running toward the building. I didn't look back to see if they were still following me. I just ran. When I burst through the doors of the diner, I must have looked like a madman. The few people inside stared at me, wide-eyed, as I tried to catch my breath. I looked out the window, expecting to see the car pull into the lot, but it didn't. They were gone. I don't know what they wanted, or why they followed me, but I haven't driven that road since. I don't think I ever will. It was around 11 p.m., I think. The clock on the old stove in the kitchen had been stuck at 6:23 ever since I got there, so I was just guessing based on how long I'd been sitting in front of the TV. I'd rented this little farmhouse out in the country for the weekend, just to get away from everything. It wasn't too far from town, maybe a 15-minute drive, but far enough that you couldn't see any other houses from the windows. The closest neighbor was probably a mile down the road, which was fine with me. I wanted the quiet. The house itself was old, creaky. You know the kind, wood floors that groan when you step on them, doors that don't quite close right, windows that let in the sound of every gust of wind. There was a small bedroom upstairs, a bathroom with old tiles, and the living room, where I was sitting on an old, sagging couch. The TV barely worked, just a few channels with static in between, but I wasn't really watching. I was tired and thinking about heading to bed when I heard a knock. It wasn't loud, more like a soft tapping. 3 quick knocks on the front door. I sat there for a second, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived that morning, and the house sat so far off the road that it didn't make sense for anyone to just show up. But after a minute of silence, I heard it again, 3 knocks, just a little louder this time. I got up, my legs feeling stiff from sitting too long, and walked over to the front door. The porch light outside wasn't working, so when I opened the door, all I could see was the blackness of the night. The air was cold, colder than I expected, and I could smell damp earth, the kind that comes right before rain. There was no one there. I stepped out onto the porch, squinting into the darkness, but all I could make out was the gravel driveway disappearing into the trees. The wind rustled through the leaves, but aside from that, it was dead quiet. I called out, "Hello?" my voice sounding strange and small in the stillness. Nothing. Just the wind. I stood there for a few more seconds, listening, but all I heard was the sound of my own breathing. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, and stood there for a minute, wondering if maybe it had just been the house settling, or some animal scurrying around outside. It wasn't like I was used to being out here in the middle of nowhere. I was probably just jumpy. I shook it off, headed back to the couch, and turned the TV off. I figured I'd better just call it a night. The bedroom was upstairs, and the wooden stairs creaked with every step as I made my way up. I brushed my teeth in the little bathroom and crawled into the bed, pulling the old quilt up to my chin. It was colder upstairs, and the windows rattled slightly in their frames whenever the wind picked up. I was lying there, just starting to drift off, when I heard it again. The knock. 3 quick knocks, but this time they sounded like they were coming from the side door, the one that led out to the back of the house. I sat up, heart pounding now, straining to listen. For a second, everything was quiet again, and I started to think I'd imagined it until I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch outside, moving around the house. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps circled around toward the front of the house. They stopped just below the window in the bedroom, right beneath where I was lying. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything to happen, but after a few seconds, there was just silence. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, and I didn't hear anything else. No more knocks, no more footsteps. Just the wind outside, and the occasional creak of the house settling. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some animal wandering around the property, maybe a branch tapping against the side of the house. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there, watching. I lay awake for what felt like hours, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the wind and the creaks of the old house. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Pale light was coming in through the window, and everything seemed normal again. I got up, feeling groggy and a little embarrassed about how freaked out I'd been. I made some coffee, took it out to the porch, and sat in one of the old rocking chairs, looking out over the fields. Everything was quiet, peaceful. I thought about the knocks again, but in the daylight, it all seemed so silly. Probably just my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe an animal like I thought. The day passed uneventfully. I drove into town for a bit, picked up some groceries, and spent most of the afternoon reading. By the time the sun started to set, the wind had picked up again, making the old house groan as it settled. I felt that same sense of unease creeping back in, but I pushed it down. I wasn't going to let some weird noises freak me out. That night, though, it happened again. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard the knocks. 3 quick taps on the front door, just like before. My heart started racing immediately, and I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Then, the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, circling the house. This time, I didn't move. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening as the footsteps made their way around to the side of the house, then to the back door. I heard the doorknob rattle, like someone was trying to turn it, but the door didn't open. The footsteps moved again, back toward the front of the house, and I heard the soft creak of the porch steps. I didn't want to go downstairs. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I couldn't just stay up there, waiting. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my chest, and crept down the stairs. Every step creaked, but I tried to move slowly, not making too much noise. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I went to the front door and stood there, listening. Everything was silent again. No footsteps, no knocks. Just the wind outside. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself to open the door, to look outside, but I couldn't. Something in me knew that if I opened that door, I wouldn't like what I found. I went back upstairs, crawled into bed, and pulled the covers up to my chin. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sound, any sign that whoever or whatever was out there was still around. By the time morning came, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if it was just my imagination or some harmless prank. Something about that place wasn't right, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out what it was. I packed my things as quickly as I could, threw them in the car, and didn't look back. It was late, maybe around 1 a.m., and I was driving back from a friend's place out in the sticks. The kind of country road where there's nothing for miles, just fields and trees. It was pitch dark, and the only thing lighting up the road was my headlights. I had my windows down, trying to keep myself awake with the cool air. The radio wasn't getting any signal out there, so it was just me and the sound of my tires rolling along the cracked pavement. I was about halfway home when I saw the car. At first, it just looked like a set of flashing hazard lights in the distance. I thought someone might have had a breakdown or maybe a flat tire. As I got closer, I could see it was an old sedan, sitting at an angle on the shoulder of the road, lights blinking, engine off. There wasn't another car or house for miles. The whole stretch of road was just woods on either side. I slowed down, thinking maybe someone needed help. The last thing you want to do is leave someone stranded out there, especially that late. I pulled over a few feet ahead of the car, leaving my engine running and my headlights on, cutting through the darkness. I grabbed my phone, but I didn't have any service. Typical for out there. I figured I'd at least check if anyone was inside and maybe drive up the road until I got a signal to call for help. When I stepped out of my car, the air hit me like ice. I was only wearing a t-shirt, and I could feel the cold sinking into my skin. The road was dead quiet, aside from the ticking sound of my cooling engine and the distant, steady blink of the hazard lights from the other car. The woods on either side of the road were just solid black, like a wall of darkness. It was the kind of quiet that makes you uneasy, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat. I walked toward the car, taking slow steps, feeling the gravel crunch under my boots. As I got closer, I could see the front door was cracked open just a little, like someone had gotten out in a hurry. I stopped a few feet away, suddenly feeling like maybe I shouldn't be there. Something about the way the door was open, the engine off but lights still flashing, it didn't feel right. I leaned in a little, trying to peer through the window, but it was too dark to see much inside. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed back at me from the trees. Nothing. No response, no movement. I looked down the road, half expecting someone to come walking out of the dark, but it was just me and that empty road. I walked around to the driver's side and nudged the door open with the back of my hand. The inside of the car was a mess, papers scattered all over the seats, an old coffee cup rolling around on the floor. But no one was inside. The keys were still in the ignition, and the seatbelt was hanging loose, like someone had left in a hurry. That feeling in my gut got worse. I thought about turning back, just getting in my car and driving off. But then I heard something. Footsteps. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind, the way it rattles the trees sometimes. But these were heavy, fast, and they were getting closer. I froze, my hand still resting on the open door of the car. The footsteps were coming from the woods, just beyond the tree line, and they were moving fast, like someone running. I turned toward the sound, squinting into the darkness. I couldn't see anything. My heart was pounding now, that kind of tight feeling in your chest when you know something's not right. The footsteps got louder, and then I saw it, a shape, a shadow, darting between the trees, coming straight toward me. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No answer. Just those footsteps, getting closer, faster. It sounded like more than one person now, like several people running through the woods, branches snapping underfoot. I backed up, my mind racing. This wasn't right. There was no way someone would just run through the woods like that, not out here, not in the middle of the night. I turned toward my car, ready to get the hell out of there, but before I could even take a step, I heard something behind me. Another set of footsteps. Close. Way too close. I whipped around, and there, standing just at the edge of the woods, was a man. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he was tall, wearing dark clothes, and he wasn't moving. Just standing there, watching me. My stomach dropped. I didn't wait. I bolted toward my car, slamming the door behind me, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I jammed them into the ignition and cranked the engine. My headlights lit up the road in front of me, but as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw them. More figures, stepping out of the woods, moving toward the car, fast. I hit the gas. The tires spun for a second on the loose gravel before catching, and I shot forward, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. The road ahead was just a blur of black and white from my headlights, and I kept glancing in the mirror, expecting to see them following me. But they were gone. Just the empty road behind me, fading into the distance. I drove for what felt like hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they ached. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, pulling into a gas station under the harsh fluorescent lights. I sat there in the car for a long time, engine running, trying to calm down, my mind racing. Who the hell were they? What were they doing out there? And why were they running at me like that? I still don't know. Part of me wonders if it was some kind of setup, like they'd left the car there hoping someone would stop, then. I don't know. I don't even want to think about what they would have done if I hadn't gotten out of there. I never found out what happened with that car, and I didn't report it. Honestly, I just wanted to forget the whole thing. I live alone in a small apartment on the third floor of an old building. It's a quiet place, which I like, and not many people come in and out at night. The area is not too busy, and the most I'd ever dealt with in terms of interruptions was the occasional noise from the neighbors or a car alarm going off. But a couple of nights ago, something happened that still makes me feel uneasy when I think about it. It was around 11 p.m., and I was just getting ready for bed. I'd already turned off the TV and put my phone on the charger when I heard a knock on my door. It wasn't a loud knock, but it was enough to make me pause. I don't usually get visitors, especially not that late. I froze for a second, listening, hoping maybe it was just a mistake, but the knock came again, a little louder this time. I thought about ignoring it, but my curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing there was a guy, maybe in his mid-30s, holding a large brown paper bag in one hand, the kind restaurants use for takeout. He was wearing one of those jackets that delivery drivers wear, the kind with a logo on it, but I didn't recognize the company. His face looked normal enough, maybe a little tired, but nothing stood out that would have made me feel uneasy right away. I opened the door a crack, keeping the chain on, just in case. "Can I help you?" I asked, still trying to make sense of why he was at my door. "Yeah, I got your delivery," he said, lifting the bag a bit as if to show me. I was confused because I hadn't ordered anything. I hadn't used any delivery apps in days. I didn't order any food, I told him. He frowned, looking down at a piece of paper in his hand. "It says right here, this address." "You sure? Maybe someone else in the apartment?" "No," I said, more firmly this time. "It's just me, and I didn't order anything." There was a pause, and I expected him to apologize, say it was a mix-up, and leave. But instead, he shifted on his feet and looked at me again, this time with an odd expression. Not angry, but like he wasn't ready to walk away. "Look, it's late," he said, almost too casually. "Are you sure you didn't forget? Maybe someone ordered it for you?" "No, I'm sure," I repeated, feeling more uneasy by the second. "You've got the wrong apartment." He didn't leave, though. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and leaned a little closer to the door. "Why don't you open up a bit more so I can check the order with you? It's probably just a mistake, but I need to make sure." That's when the alarm bells really went off. There was no reason for him to need to come inside. My hand was gripping the door now, keeping it as closed as I could with the chain still on. "No, thank you," I said. "I don't need to check anything." "You should go." For a second, he didn't move, and I swore I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Frustration, maybe? I couldn't quite tell. But then he smiled, a tight, forced kind of smile, and tried again. "I just need to come in for a second, make sure you're safe. You know, people make these orders sometimes when they're in trouble. It happens. I can check with you." "No," I said, louder this time, cutting him off. "I'm not in trouble. I didn't order anything. Please leave." That smile faded, and his face went blank. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stared at me through the gap in the door. Then he reached up and put his hand on the door frame, as if he was thinking about pushing it open. I slammed the door shut, locking it fully. My heart was racing, and I backed away quickly, keeping my eyes on the door. I thought that would be the end of it, that he'd leave, but then he started knocking again, harder this time. "Ma'am," he called through the door, his voice louder and sharper now. I need to come in and make sure you're okay. You don't sound okay. I didn't respond. I was frozen, just staring at the door, hoping he'd get the message and leave, but he didn't. The knocking turned into pounding, and now he was really trying to get me to open up. I know you're in there, he shouted, his voice losing that polite tone it had before. You have to let me in. I need to check on you. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking as I dialed 911. The operator picked up quickly, and I explained what was happening, barely able to keep my voice steady. As I talked, the pounding on the door kept getting louder, and now he was shouting things I couldn't even make out, just loud and angry. I've got police on the way, the operator told me, her voice calm but firm. Stay on the line with me. Don't open the door. I wasn't planning to. I could hear him outside, his fist banging on the wood like he was trying to break it down. I didn't know what he wanted, but it was clear this wasn't just about a delivery mix-up anymore. A minute later, everything went quiet. No more pounding, no more shouting. Just silence. I stayed on the line with the operator, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. Then I heard footsteps, fading down the hallway. The police are almost there, the operator said, still on the line with me. Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone but them. I waited, feeling every second stretch out like an hour. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and a few minutes later, there was a knock on my door again, this time followed by someone shouting, "Police." I looked through the peephole, and sure enough, there were 2 officers standing outside. I opened the door slowly, and they came in, checking the hallway, asking me what happened. I told them everything, still trying to wrap my head around it all. They took my statement and said they'd keep an eye on the area, but they didn't find the guy. He was long gone by the time they arrived. After they left, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how persistent he'd been, how he refused to leave, how he tried to push his way in under the guise of checking if I was safe. I never found out who he was, or why he was there, but the idea that he could have gotten in still sends chills down my spine. I haven't ordered food delivery since then, and I make sure to double-check my locks every night. Living alone is different now. I had been out shopping late, just picking up a few things after work. It was one of those days where you lose track of time, and by the time I was done, the parking lot was nearly empty. It's this big lot behind the store, mostly dark except for a couple of lights near the entrance. My car was parked pretty far out because when I got there earlier, the lot had been full. It was cold, too, that kind of biting cold that creeps into your bones, and I was in a hurry to get home. I had a couple of bags in each hand as I made my way to the car, minding my own business, when I saw someone coming toward me from the other side of the lot. He was wearing a hoodie, jeans, nothing too weird at first glance. But I remember thinking it was odd because he wasn't coming from any of the nearby cars, just kind of appeared from the shadows near the edge of the parking lot. As he got closer, he waved, a little too eagerly, and called out to me. "Hey, man. Can you help me with something?" I slowed down, not wanting to be rude but also not entirely comfortable with a stranger approaching me that late at night. I shifted the bags in my hands and stopped a few feet from my car. I figured maybe he needed directions or something. People ask that kind of stuff sometimes, especially if they're not from the area. "Yeah, what do you need?" I asked, trying to keep it casual, even though something about him was setting off alarms in my head. He got closer, too close, and I realized he was a bit older than me, maybe in his late 30s or early 40s. His face was pale, and he had this strange grin, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "You from around here?" he asked. glancing around the empty lot. I nodded, trying to stay polite but keeping my distance. Yeah, I know the area. Oh, cool, he said, stepping even closer. I'm looking for a street, can't remember the name. You wouldn't happen to know the neighborhoods around here, would you? Like where people live. Something about the way he said where people live made my skin crawl. He wasn't just asking for directions, he was fishing for something, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I took a step back, gripping the bags tighter. I'm not really sure, I said. There's a lot of neighborhoods around. What street are you looking for? He didn't answer right away, just stared at me, that grin still plastered on his face. His eyes darted to my car, and then back to me. You live around here? What's your street? Maybe it's close by. That's when I really started to feel uncomfortable. The way he asked it, so casual but invasive, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He wasn't looking for directions, and I knew it. I tried to brush it off, but my voice came out a little more tense than I wanted. Nah, I don't live around here. He tilted his head, still smiling, but it was different now, more like a smirk. Really? You don't look like you're from far away. I bet you live close. Maybe I can follow you there, huh? That way I won't get lost. My heart started to race, and I could feel my palms sweating even though it was freezing outside. I looked around the lot, hoping maybe someone else was around, but there was no one. Just me, him, and my car. I was too far from the store to make a run for it, and he was blocking my path to the car, just standing there, waiting for me to say something. I swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. Look, man, I can't help you. I've got to get going. I took another step back, hoping he'd take the hint and leave me alone. But he didn't move. In fact, he stepped closer, now only a few feet away. Come on, just tell me where you live. It'll be easier if you just show me. I'm sure it's not far. I took another step back, my hand shaking now, and glanced at my car. I was so close, but he was right in my way. He noticed me looking and stepped even closer, blocking me completely. His grin was gone now, replaced with a cold, almost blank expression. Why don't you just tell me, he said, his voice lower, almost threatening. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get out of this without making it worse. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, but I couldn't see a way around him. The lot was too empty, too quiet, and I knew if I made the wrong move, things could go bad fast. I tried to stay calm, forcing my voice to sound steady. Look, man, I don't know you, and I don't feel comfortable. I'm leaving. I started to move, trying to push past him, but he stepped in front of me, his hand reaching out like he was about to grab me. Just tell me, he said, his voice hard now, almost a growl. Tell me where you live. That's when panic set in. I didn't think, I just acted. I dropped one of the bags and shoved him as hard as I could, catching him off guard. He stumbled back, and I used that moment to bolt for my car. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I fumbled with my keys, my hand shaking so badly it took me a second to get the door unlocked. I glanced over my shoulder, and he was already coming toward me again, faster now, his face twisted with anger. I managed to get the door open and threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut just as he reached the car. He pounded on the window, shouting something I couldn't make out, but I didn't care. I jammed the key into the ignition and turned it, the engine roaring to life. I didn't waste any time. I threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the parking spot, barely missing him as I backed up. He jumped out of the way, but I didn't stop to see where he went. I just slammed on the gas and sped out of the lot, my hand shaking so badly I could barely keep control of the wheel. I didn't stop until I was halfway home, pulling over to the side of the road to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to calm down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching me. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I know it wasn't just directions. I can't stop thinking about how persistent he was, how he kept pushing, trying to get personal information, trying to block me from leaving. I haven't been back to that store since, and I don't plan to. It was just past midnight, and I had been sitting in the living room, trying to unwind after a long day. I wasn't doing anything special, just flipping through channels on the TV. The house was quiet, and I was the only one awake. It's an older house, tucked away on a quiet street, so I've always felt pretty safe here. There aren't many neighbors, just a few houses down the street, but it's a calm area where nothing really happens. I was about to get up and go to bed when something caught my eye through the thin curtains over the living room window. It wasn't much, just a quick movement outside, but enough to make me look again. I don't usually pay much attention to the road this late at night, but for some reason, this felt different. There was a van parked on the street, directly across from my house. It was one of those plain white ones with no windows in the back, the kind that just looks suspicious no matter what. It wasn't there earlier, and I hadn't seen or heard it pull up. That part stuck with me because my street is quiet at night. If a car drives by, you usually notice. I stood up, my eyes fixed on the van. It was just sitting there, not running or anything. I couldn't see anyone inside, not from where I was standing. I thought maybe it belonged to someone visiting a neighbor, but none of my neighbors had visitors this late. And something about the way it was just sitting there didn't feel right. I went to the front door and locked it. I didn't know why, but it felt like the right thing to do. Then I walked back to the window, trying to peek through the small gap in the curtains without moving them too much. That's when I saw the headlights flick on. The van didn't start, not right away, but the lights clicked on, bright against the dark street. I felt my stomach drop. Whoever was inside was awake and watching. My house, probably. There was no reason for them to just sit there like that, especially not this late at night. I thought about calling someone, maybe the police, but what would I say? There's a van outside? They're not doing anything illegal. Not yet, at least. So I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, hoping it would just drive away. But it didn't. Instead, the van slowly started creeping forward. Not fast, just inching down the street. Toward my house. The headlights stayed on, casting this eerie glow through the front window. I backed away from the window, not wanting to be seen, but I kept watching. It stopped again, right at the edge of my driveway. I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath coming faster. Why was it stopping? Why here? There's no reason for anyone to be outside my house like this, especially in the middle of the night. I thought about going upstairs and hiding, maybe calling someone after all. But I didn't. I couldn't move, just kept staring at the van like if I looked away, something worse might happen. The engine started up. I heard it rumble softly, and the van rolled forward again, this time turning slightly to angle into my driveway. I don't know what I expected, maybe for it to just keep going, maybe for this to be some strange misunderstanding, but it didn't. It pulled right up into my driveway, stopping just feet from my front door. Now I was really starting to panic. My house is small, and the front door is only a few steps away from where I stood. The windows don't have locks, just thin latches. My mind was racing, thinking about all the ways someone could break in, all the places I could hide if they did. But I didn't move, couldn't think clearly enough to do anything useful. The van sat there for what felt like forever. I thought maybe they were waiting for me to make the first move, but I wasn't going outside. No way was I opening that door. The thought of them watching me, knowing I was inside, was enough to make my skin crawl. Then the driver's side door opened. A man stepped out, but I couldn't see his face clearly in the dark. He was tall, wearing a jacket with the hood pulled up. He didn't go to the front door, though. Instead, he walked around the van and opened the back doors. I couldn't see inside from where I was standing, but I heard the sound of something being dragged out. Something heavy, by the sound of it. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. My hands were shaking. I reached for my phone, but it was still on the couch, too far away to grab without moving closer to the window. Then I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming closer to the house. I backed up further into the hallway, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I didn't want him to know I was standing right there, watching. The footsteps stopped at the front door. I could hear him breathing now, low and steady, just on the other side. My hand was still shaking as I gripped the edge of the wall, trying to stay hidden. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't try the door, praying he would just leave. But then the door handle rattled. Not hard, just enough to check if it was unlocked. It wasn't. I made sure of that. But the fact that he tried, that he was right there, sent a wave of cold fear through me. I couldn't see him anymore, but I could hear him, still standing just outside, still breathing. There was a long silence. I didn't know what he was doing, but I wasn't about to move and find out. I stayed frozen in place, my back pressed against the wall. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of the van door closing. His footsteps moved away from the house, back toward the driveway. I dared to peek around the corner, just in time to see him getting back into the van. He didn't slam the door, didn't even look in my direction. He just started the engine again and backed out of the driveway, the headlights still glaring through the window as he pulled away. I didn't move until the van was out of sight, disappearing down the street. Even then, I couldn't breathe properly. I stood there, staring at the empty driveway, trying to convince myself that it was over, that he was gone. But I didn't feel safe. Not really. I stayed up the rest of the night, double-checking all the locks, walking through the house, peeking out the windows every few minutes to make sure he wasn't coming back. Every sound made me jump, every shadow looked like someone lurking outside. The police wouldn't have done anything if I had called them. I know that. But I still wonder what would have happened if I had waited just a little longer before locking the door. What if I had stepped outside? What if I hadn't noticed the van at all? I never saw that van again, but sometimes, late at night, I still look out the window, just to make sure. Just to be safe. I was in the office late again. It wasn't unusual for me to stay late. I had fallen behind on some reports and knew I wouldn't be able to catch up if I left at the usual time. Everyone else had already gone home. The building had that empty, still feeling it always gets after hours. You could hear every little sound, the hum of the lights, the quiet clicking of the air conditioner, the occasional creak of the floorboards as the place settled. I was sitting at my desk, eyes starting to blur from staring at the screen for too long. I had a few more spreadsheets to go over, just some last-minute number checks before I could leave. I had a playlist going quietly in the background, something to help keep me focused. It must have been around 11 p.m. when I heard it. Typing. Just a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the next room over. At first, I didn't think much of it. It didn't register right away because I was so focused on my work. But then I paused, hands hovering over my own keyboard, and listened. There it was again, the distinct sound of keys being pressed, like someone working at a computer. I frowned, glancing at the clock. No one else was supposed to be here. The cleaning crew didn't come until the early morning hours, and there wasn't any reason for anyone to be working this late, especially not in the room next to mine. I stood up, walking over to the doorway of my office and peering out into the dimly lit hallway. The sound was clearer now, the typing coming from the desk in the adjacent room. It was steady, like someone deep in concentration, typing out an email or a report. For a second, I thought maybe someone else had stayed late too, and I just hadn't noticed. But I knew that wasn't right. I'd been the last one here when everyone else left. I'd even checked the other offices out of habit, making sure the lights were off. The tapping continued as I stepped into the hallway. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something felt wrong. The typing was too constant, too fast. No pauses, no hesitation, just key after key being pressed with this unnatural rhythm. I reached the doorway to the other office, the one where the sound was coming from. It was dark inside, but I could still hear the typing, loud and clear, like someone was sitting right at the desk. But when I flipped the light switch, the room was empty. No one was there. The desk was neat, the chair pushed in, and the computer was off. The typing stopped the second the light came on, like it had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. My heart was starting to race, that prickling feeling crawling up my spine. I walked over to the desk, running my hand over the smooth surface, and nothing seemed out of place. The computer wasn't warm, and there were no signs that it had been turned on recently. It was just a normal, empty office. I backed out of the room, flicking the light off again, and returned to my desk. I sat down, telling myself I must have been hearing things. Maybe I was just tired, my mind playing tricks on me after hours of staring at numbers. That's all it was. I took a deep breath and tried to refocus. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The office felt different now, heavier somehow. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was nothing. Just me and the soft glow of my computer screen. I tried to get back to work, but I couldn't concentrate. My hands hovered over the keyboard, and I kept looking up, listening for the typing again. A few minutes passed, and then I heard it. The typing, this time coming from further down the hall. I stood up quickly, the chair scraping against the floor behind me. My heart was pounding now, that cold, sinking feeling settling into my stomach. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was typing, and it wasn't me. I grabbed my phone and walked down the hall, this time checking the break room. The lights were off, and the place was silent. I flipped the switch and scanned the room, but again, no one was there. The sound had stopped the second I stepped inside. I couldn't explain it. I knew I wasn't alone. There was someone, or something, in the building with me, and I couldn't see them. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence, trying to calm myself down. Maybe it was the building settling, or maybe it was something mechanical, like the air conditioner kicking on in a weird way. I decided I had enough for the night. I went back to my office, shut down my computer, and grabbed my bag. As I was about to head for the door, I glanced at my screen one last time, just to make sure everything was saved. That's when I noticed the files. Several of my documents were missing. Important ones, spreadsheets I'd been working on earlier that night. At first, I thought maybe I'd saved them to the wrong folder, but after a quick search, they were nowhere to be found. They weren't in the trash either. It was like they'd been deleted, just gone from the system entirely. My stomach turned. I hadn't touched those files in hours. There was no reason for them to be missing. I opened a few more folders, and more files were gone. Entire reports I'd spent weeks on just vanished. I felt a surge of panic as I realized this wasn't a glitch. Someone had been in my system, messing with my work. I spun around in my chair, looking at the doorway again. The office was quiet, but I knew I wasn't alone. Someone had accessed my computer while I was here, but there had been no footsteps, no signs of anyone moving around. Just the typing, that constant clicking I couldn't explain. I shut down the computer and grabbed my things, my hands shaking. I wasn't sticking around to figure it out. I rushed down the hall, not even bothering to turn off the lights. The building felt darker now, like it was closing in on me. I could feel eyes on me, but every time I looked back, there was nothing. No movement, no one there. I made it to the elevator and jabbed the button, praying it would come quickly. As I stood there, waiting, I heard it again. Typing. Soft, faint, but definitely there, coming from one of the offices behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know or what was making that sound. The elevator door slid open, and I stepped inside, my heart racing as I hit the button for the ground floor. The typing continued, growing louder, more frantic. But no one was there. There couldn't be anyone there. The doors closed, cutting off the sound, and I was left standing in the small, dimly lit elevator, my breath coming in shaky gasps. I stared at the floor numbers ticking down, feeling a sense of relief as I got closer to the exit. When the doors finally opened, I practically ran out of the building. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't stop until I was in my car with the doors locked. I sat there for a moment, trying to catch my breath, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I never stayed late again after that. Something had been in that building with me, something I couldn't explain. And it wasn't just a glitch in the system or a weird echo. It was real. And I wasn't going to stick around to see what happened next. I don't know who or what was in that office with me that night, but I can still hear it sometimes. The typing. Just faint enough to make me wonder if I'm imagining it, but always there, just out of reach. I had just finished a late shift at work, the kind where you lose track of time staring at a screen for too long. It was one of those days where I barely noticed the hours slipping by, and by the time I packed up and headed out, it was already well past midnight. My apartment building had an underground parking garage dimly lit, always feeling like it belonged in some horror movie. But I never thought much of it. I just wanted to get home and sleep. I parked my car in the usual spot. Nothing seemed off, just the same dull, quiet atmosphere. The garage lights flickered a bit like they always did, casting long, ugly shadows across the concrete walls and floor. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, locked the car, and started walking toward the elevator. I was only a few steps away when I heard them. Footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my own feet echoing off the concrete walls. That happens sometimes in these kinds of garages, sound bouncing around. But something about it was different. It wasn't in sync with my steps. They came right after mine, like someone following a little too close behind. I stopped. The footsteps stopped too. I glanced over my shoulder, but the place was empty. There was just my car behind me, the same pillars and faded parking lines, nothing out of the ordinary. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I stood there for a second, listening to the silence, trying to convince myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. I started walking again, faster this time. The footsteps came again. Not loud, but just loud enough to make my heart race. They were quick, matching my pace, and they stopped again the moment I did. I whipped around, looking back over my shoulder, and that's when I saw a shadow, just for a split second, ducking behind one of the concrete pillars. Someone was there. I didn't see much, just a shape, a figure slipping out of sight. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a coincidence. There was someone in the garage with me, hiding. I stood frozen, staring at the pillar, waiting for them to move again, to step out or show themselves. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The garage was dead silent now. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to fade into the background. All I could hear was my own shaky breathing. What should I do? Should I run? Should I go back to my car and lock myself in? But if I went back to the car, I have to turn my back to that pillar, and I didn't want to do that. Whoever was there, they were watching me. I slowly started backing up, keeping my eyes on the spot where I'd seen the figure. My hands were shaking, and I felt this tight knot of fear in my chest, like something heavy sitting on my ribs. I was close to the elevator now, just a few more steps, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the pillar. I didn't want to give them a chance to move again. The elevator doors were just to my right. I reached out, still facing the garage, and hit the button. I kept waiting to hear something, the footsteps again, or maybe the sound of someone moving, but nothing came. It was just that awful, pressing silence. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. For a second, I didn't move, still staring at the pillar, my heart racing so fast I could barely think straight. Then, all at once, I darted inside, my finger jamming the button for my floor. The doors closed, cutting off the view of the garage, and I sagged back against the wall, feeling like I was about to throw up. I was shaking. I tried to take a deep breath, but it felt like I couldn't get enough air. My mind was racing. Who was that? What did they want? Why were they following me? The fear clung to me like a weight, making it hard to think straight. The elevator ride felt like it took forever, even though it was only a few floors. When the doors finally opened, I practically sprinted to my apartment. My hands were trembling so badly I fumbled with my keys at the door, but I managed to get inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking every bolt. For a long time, I just stood there in the entryway, staring at the door, half expecting to hear someone pounding on it, or worse, to see the doorknob start to turn. But nothing happened. The silence inside my apartment felt deafening, and the more I stood there, the more I started to wonder if maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it had just been a homeless person, someone looking for a quiet place to sleep. Maybe they hadn't even noticed me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I went to bed eventually, but I didn't sleep. I kept listening for any sound from the hallway, any hint that someone was outside my door. My heart wouldn't slow down, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow darting behind the pillar, playing over and over in my mind. The next day, I didn't park in the garage. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept thinking about those footsteps, how they had matched mine exactly, how they stopped when I stopped. Whoever had been down there, they hadn't just been passing through. They were following me. Watching. For the next few nights, I avoided going down to the garage late. I found reasons to stay at work longer or parked in a different lot entirely. I tried to push it out of my mind, but the feeling of being watched never really went away. A few days later, I couldn't avoid it anymore. I had to work late again, and by the time I got back, the only parking available was in the underground garage. My stomach dropped as I drove in, the lights flickering above me like they always did. The place was just as empty and quiet as before, the same shadows stretching across the walls. I parked my car and sat there for a minute, trying to gather the courage to get out. My heart was already racing, my hands gripping the steering wheel. I told myself I was being stupid, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the moment I stepped out of the car, I heard them again. Footsteps. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, soft footsteps, echoing off the concrete, coming from somewhere behind me. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the garage. There was no one there, just the empty rows of parked cars and those damned flickering lights. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, that heavy, pressing feeling of being watched. I started walking, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a run. The footsteps followed, getting louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, and there, just for a split second, I saw the figure again. This time, they weren't hiding behind a pillar. They were standing out in the open, just a dark silhouette against the concrete wall, watching me. I didn't wait. I sprinted to the elevator, slamming the button and praying for the doors to open faster. The footsteps were right behind me now, closer than ever, but I didn't dare look back. The elevator dinged, and I threw myself inside, hitting the button for my floor and leaning back against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The door slid shut just as I heard the footsteps stop outside. I didn't look. I couldn't. When the elevator reached my floor, I stumbled out, barely able to catch my breath. I ran to my apartment, fumbled with the keys again, and locked myself inside. This time, I didn't wait by the door. I grabbed my phone and called the building management, telling them everything. They said they'd check the security cameras, but the next day, I got a call back. There was nothing. No one had been in the garage. No one but me. I don't park in the garage anymore. I don't care if I have to walk an extra mile to find a spot. I'm not going back down there. I had just finished up another late shift at the restaurant, and all I wanted was to get home, take off my shoes, and sleep. It was already past midnight, and the streets were empty. That was normal for that time of night, especially around where I worked. The city felt different when it was quiet like that, not quite the same during the day, almost like it wasn't real. Everything was still, and the streetlights flickered as if they were struggling to stay awake too. I didn't live far, just about a 10-minute walk. Normally, it wasn't a problem. I'd done it countless times before, late shifts, early mornings, same route home. I knew the streets well. There was a main road, then a few blocks through quieter areas before reaching my building. Most nights, it felt safe enough. No one really hung around at that hour, and the worst I'd usually see were a few drunks stumbling out of the bars. That night felt the same at first. I walked out of work, checked my phone, put my headphones in, and started walking. The air was cold, sharp, but it helped keep me awake. I wasn't really thinking about anything, just trying to stay warm and get home. I was halfway down the main road when I noticed him. At first, I didn't think much of it. He was just a guy, walking a little behind me, maybe 30 feet or so. He wasn't doing anything strange, just walking. But something about him caught my attention. Maybe it was because the street was empty, and seeing anyone else out there felt off, like they didn't belong. Or maybe it was the way he walked. He wasn't moving slow, wasn't drunk, but there was something deliberate about his pace. Like he knew where he was going, but he was in no rush to get there. I didn't think too much of it. I crossed the street, more out of habit than anything else. The sidewalk on the other side felt better lit, a little closer to the busier part of the road. Safer, I guess. But when I crossed, I noticed the guy crossed too. That was when the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. I glanced over my shoulder, just a quick look, trying not to make it obvious. He was still behind me, still walking at the same steady pace. There was something off about it now. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I felt it deep in my gut. I picked up my pace, just a little, enough to put more distance between us. He sped up too. That's when I knew something was wrong. I kept walking, faster now, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was in a hurry, or we were just heading in the same direction. That's what I kept telling myself. But no matter how much I tried to shake the thought, that feeling in my gut only grew stronger. I turned down a side street, one of the quieter ones. It was closer to my place, and I figured if he was still following me, I'd know for sure. As soon as I turned the corner, I heard his footsteps behind me. They weren't loud, but they were there, matching my pace, keeping time with every step I took. I didn't dare look back. I just kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest. My building wasn't far now, just a few more blocks. But each step felt like it took forever. The streets were empty, no cars, no people, nothing but me and him. I sped up again, almost jogging now, but trying to keep it casual, like I wasn't running away. His footsteps followed, getting closer. I could feel him behind me, that presence, like a weight pressing on the back of my neck. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But I didn't want to panic. I didn't want to let him know I was scared. I turned another corner, faster this time, hoping to lose him, hoping that maybe if I moved quick enough, he wouldn't follow. But the second I turned, I heard him again, closer now, his footsteps quickening to match mine. I was running. I didn't care anymore. I wasn't trying to hide it. I bolted down the street, my legs pumping as fast as they could go. My breath was ragged, my chest tight, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, running too, his footsteps slapping against the pavement, closing the distance between us. My building was just up ahead. I could see it, the entrance lit up like a beacon in the dark. I didn't look back, didn't slow down. I sprinted for it, my keys already in my hand, fumbling as I reached for the door. I slammed into the entrance, my fingers shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the lock. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding in my ears, getting closer with every second. My heart was racing, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. Finally, the key turned, and I threw the door open, stumbling inside. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it as fast as I could. My breath was coming in short, shallow gasps, my whole body shaking. I leaned against the door, listening, waiting. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. The only sound was my own breathing, echoing in the empty hallway. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just stood there, pressed against the door, waiting for something to happen. But it didn't. Slowly, I pulled myself away from the door, my legs shaky, my head spinning. I made my way to the window, peeking up through the blinds, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting. But the street was empty. There was no one there. Just the same quiet street, the same flickering streetlights. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound made me jump, every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside. I kept checking the window, expecting to see him again, but he was gone. I never saw him again after that night. But I still think about it, still hear those footsteps in my head sometimes when I'm walking home late. It's funny how something so small can get under your skin, how it sticks with you, even after it's over. I don't walk home late anymore. I take a cab. Every time. The night had been long, filled with laughter, and far too many drinks. I was happy, enjoying the company of friends and forgetting about work for a while. The party was at a bar downtown, and when it ended, I realized I was tired and needed to get home. It was late, and I didn't want to wait for the bus. I decided to get a cab. I stood outside, leaning against the cold brick wall of the bar, trying to catch my breath and gather my thoughts. The air was crisp, and I shivered a little as I pulled my jacket tighter around me. It was one of those nights where everything felt electric, and the city buzzed with an energy that made me feel alive. A cab pulled up almost immediately, and I climbed in without hesitating. "Where to?" the driver asked, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. He looked middle-aged, with a friendly face and a beard speckled with gray. "Can you take me to Maple Street?" I replied, giving him my address. He nodded, and we set off, the familiar streets flashing by outside the window. At first, he chatted easily, asking me how my night had been. I smiled and replied, keeping the conversation light. I was too tired to engage in much, but he seemed nice enough, and I figured it was just a casual conversation. But then, he started to ask more personal questions. "So, do you live around here?" he inquired. I answered, keeping it vague. "What do you do for work?" he pressed. I told him I worked in marketing, and he nodded, clearly interested. "Must be nice to work with all those clients." "Do you have a boyfriend?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly. I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. The questions were beginning to feel too personal for a stranger. No, I don't," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's surprising. A pretty girl like you?" His words made me uncomfortable. I shifted in my seat, glancing at the street signs passing by. I wanted to change the subject, but he kept pushing. "What kind of guys do you like? Do you date much?" "Look, I just want to go home," I said firmly, hoping to end the conversation. He ignored my words, continuing his line of questioning. "Come on, just curious. You seem fun. We could have a good time." My stomach sank. Something in his tone felt wrong, like a switch had flipped. "Could you just drive, please?" I said, my heart racing now. I was aware of how vulnerable I was, alone in a cab with a man I barely knew. The streetlights flickered as we turned down a dark, empty road. Suddenly, he locked the doors. I heard the click, a finality that made panic shoot through me. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice rising. "Just relax. We're almost there." He didn't sound reassuring. Instead, there was an edge to his voice that filled me with dread. "Let me out," I shouted, my mind racing. I fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Let me out. Right now." He laughed again, but this time it was cruel, sending chills down my spine. "You should really just sit back and enjoy the ride." I glanced out the window, searching for any sign of people, lights, anything. But the street was deserted. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt the weight of the situation settle on my shoulders. I had to act. I needed to get out of there. "Stop the car," I shouted, my voice growing hoarse. I began to breathe heavily, trying to keep my fear at bay. "You're going the wrong way." He turned to look at me, his expression now serious. "You should stop talking." It's safer that way. The chill in his words made my blood run cold. I felt the panic rising inside me again. My mind raced, thinking of my options. I had to get out of this cab, and fast. As I looked out the window again, I spotted a gas station in the distance. It was dimly lit, but it was something. If I could just get him to stop there, I could make a run for it. Can you pull over? I need to get something from my bag, I said, trying to sound calm, trying to mask the fear in my voice. Sure, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. What do you need? Just pull over. I promise I'll make it worth your while, I said, forcing a smile, hoping he would believe me. He slowed down slightly, and I felt my heart quicken. See? Not so hard to just be nice. I glanced at the gas station again, then back at him. Please, I just need to grab my wallet. It's right there. I pointed at the bag on the seat beside me. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled into the gas station lot. I felt a flicker of hope, but knew I couldn't let my guard down. The cab came to a stop, and I saw the bright lights illuminating the area. I opened my door before he could react, spilling out of the car like a panicked animal. I ran towards the entrance of the gas station, my heart pounding in my chest. Hey! Come back, he shouted, but I didn't look back. I pushed through the door and stumbled inside, panting and wide-eyed. The clerk looked up, confusion washing over his face as I hurried to the counter. Call the police, I gasped, my voice trembling. The driver's footsteps echoed behind me, and I turned to see him standing outside the door, hands on the window, face twisted with anger. You don't want to do this, he yelled, but I knew I was safe inside. The clerk picked up the phone, his eyes darting between me and the man outside. What's going on? Just call the police. I pleaded, backing away from the door, keeping my eyes on the driver. He pounded on the window, his face red with fury. Let's just talk about this. You don't need to involve anyone else. I shook my head, terrified, but relieved as I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. The driver must have realized he was losing control because he turned and bolted back to his cab, speeding away into the night. The police arrived shortly after, and I was shaken but grateful. They took my statement, assuring me I did the right thing. They promised to look for him, but I was just thankful to be safe, to have made it out of that situation unharmed. I never took a cab again after that night. The fear of not knowing who was behind the wheel kept me from trusting anyone. I learned to take care of myself, to stay alert, and never ignore that voice inside warning me of danger. It's funny how quickly things can change, how one moment of carelessness can lead to something terrifying. But I was alive, and that was all that mattered. It was one of those long drives that felt endless, the kind where the scenery turned into a blur of trees and fields. I had taken a detour on a rural back road, trying to avoid traffic after a long day at work. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the sky, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. That calm vanished when my car suddenly sputtered, then stalled in the middle of the road. I sat there for a moment, staring at the dashboard. Nothing worked. No lights, no sounds, just silence. I sighed and put my head on the steering wheel. Great. I was miles away from the nearest town, and my phone showed no service. I was alone. After a few minutes of deliberation, I got out of the car to see if there was anything I could do. The sun was dipping lower, and the darkness began to creep in around me. I popped the hood open, hoping to find a simple fix, but all I saw were tangled wires and an engine I knew nothing about. As I stood there, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The woods surrounding the road were thick and dark, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I forced myself to breathe and focus on the task at hand. I rummaged through my glove compartment for anything useful, but all I found were old receipts and a pack of gum. Just as I was about to give up and head back to the driver's seat, a car pulled up beside mine. My heart raced as I turned to see a man in a truck, probably in his 40s, leaning out of the window. He had a scruffy beard and a friendly smile. "You need a lift," he called out, his voice warm and inviting. I hesitated. The last thing I wanted was to get into a stranger's vehicle, but I also didn't want to be stuck here as night fell. I glanced at my car. It was not going to get me anywhere tonight. Yes, please. I appreciate it, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He hopped out and opened the passenger door for me. "Get in. I can take you to town. It's not far from here." I climbed into the truck, feeling a mix of relief and unease. The interior smelled of old leather and something earthy, like fresh soil. As he started the engine, I noticed how the light inside the truck barely illuminated his face. I forced myself to smile as we began to drive. "So, what happened?" he asked, glancing at me. "Just broke down. I think the battery is dead," I replied, trying to sound casual. He nodded, a hint of understanding in his eyes. "That happens out here. These back roads can be tough on cars." He shifted gears, and we sped away from my car, the trees blurring past us. At first, the conversation flowed easily. He told me about the area, about how he used to fish nearby when he was younger. I returned the small talk, thankful that he was being friendly. But after a few minutes, I started to notice that we were heading deeper into the woods. "Are you sure we're going to town?" I asked, my heart beginning to race again as I saw nothing but trees lining the road. "Yeah, just a little shortcut. Takes you right through. Trust me, it's quicker this way." His smile didn't waver, but something about his tone made me uneasy. I looked out the window, trying to judge where we were. The road narrowed, surrounded by thick trees. The fading light made the shadows feel alive, wrapping around us. I felt a tightening in my chest. "How far is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not too far," he replied, but his eyes flickered to me, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my stomach twist. A moment later, he turned off the main road onto a dirt path. My heart sank. This isn't the way to town," I said, panic rising. "Relax, I know where I'm going," he said, his voice still calm but now tinged with an edge. "Can you just take me back?" I asked, feeling a chill spread through me. The trees closed in around us, the air thickening with tension. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he laughed, a low, unsettling sound. "You don't trust me?" "I'm just trying to help." I turned to look out the window, my mind racing. I knew I had to get out of this situation. My hands fumbled around the door handle, but he must have seen the movement because he reached over and locked the doors. "Where do you think you're going?" he said, his voice suddenly sharper, the friendliness gone. "Let me out," I shouted, my heart pounding in my ears. I was screaming now, panic flooding my system as I realized how trapped I truly was. He only chuckled, but there was nothing warm in his laughter now. "It's just a little ride. You'll be fine." I needed to stay calm. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. The road ahead was dark, but I had to find a way to escape. "Please, I'm really scared." "I just want to go home," I said, trying to sound small, hoping to appeal to whatever humanity he had left. He paused for a moment, and I could feel his eyes on me, weighing my words. Just sit tight and we can talk. You'll see, it'll be worth it. He accelerated down the dirt path, the truck bouncing over uneven ground, and I realized we were getting further from civilization, deeper into the woods. I glanced around, searching for anything I could use to defend myself. My eyes fell on a water bottle rolling on the floor by my feet. I picked it up, holding it tightly, and then I noticed something shiny in the glove compartment. It was a small knife, likely for cutting bait or string. I grabbed it, hiding it in my pocket, praying I wouldn't have to use it. Then I saw something up ahead. A clearing. My heart raced as I realized there was a chance to make a run for it. Stop the truck! I yelled. Why? He asked, a hint of annoyance creeping into his voice. Just stop. I need to get out now. He hesitated, but then I saw the clearing come into view. There was no time. Please. I begged, my voice breaking. I need to get out. With a sharp turn, he slowed down, but just as I thought I could escape, he swung the truck into the clearing. I saw an old abandoned cabin ahead, and dread washed over me. He stopped the truck and turned to me, an unsettling smile on his face. Welcome to my favorite spot. This was it. My heart pounded as I took a deep breath. I had to act fast. I'm getting out, I said firmly, reaching for the door handle again. Not so fast, he barked, but I flung the door open and bolted into the woods, adrenaline fueling my flight. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I just ran, pushing branches and brush aside, my legs moving as fast as they could. I could hear him crashing through the trees behind me, but I kept going, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stumbled but caught myself, dodging the branches that threatened to snag me. Suddenly, I burst into another clearing. In the distance, I could see lights flickering, another house, maybe a cabin. I sprinted toward it, hoping someone was inside, praying for help. I reached the porch, stumbling up the steps, and pounded on the door, shouting for help. A few moments later, a light flickered on inside. A woman opened the door, her eyes wide with confusion. What's wrong? Help me. Please. I gasped, turning to look behind me. I could see him emerging from the trees, his expression twisted with rage. Get inside, she urged, pulling me in and slamming the door shut just as he reached the porch. I felt the weight of fear lift slightly as I heard him pound on the door, but I was still terrified. The woman grabbed her phone and dialed the police while I leaned against the wall, shaking. He's outside. I gasped, looking toward the door, expecting him to break through any moment. Stay calm. They are on their way, she said, her voice steady. After a few moments that felt like an eternity, I heard sirens in the distance. The man outside yelled angrily, but I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. The police arrived quickly, and they apprehended him before he could get away. He shouted and screamed, but they handcuffed him and took him away. I sat down on the couch, my heart still racing. The woman offered me a glass of water, her hand shaking slightly. I took it and thanked her, overwhelmed with gratitude. The police took my statement, and as I recounted the details of that horrifying drive into the woods, I felt the tension in my body slowly release. I was safe. The nightmare was over. After everything settled, I left the house with a newfound respect for caution and an appreciation for the kindness of strangers. I realized just how quickly things could turn, and how important it was to trust my instincts. It was one of those nights when the air felt thick and heavy, almost pressing down on me. I had been driving for hours, trying to stay awake after a long shift at work. I thought stopping at a 24-hour convenience store might help. I pulled into the lot, the neon lights flickering in the darkness, casting strange shadows on the pavement. As I walked inside, a bell jingled above me. The store was small and cramped, with shelves stocked high and a few items scattered on the floor. I noticed the lone clerk behind the counter, a middle-aged man with glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up with a wide grin, too eager for someone just trying to grab a quick snack. "Late night run?" he asked, his voice a bit too chipper for the hour. "Just getting some coffee," I replied, keeping my tone neutral as I headed toward the back of the store. "Best coffee in town," he declared, as if it were an advertisement. I nodded, not wanting to engage too much. I grabbed a cup and poured some into it, trying to ignore his gaze fixed on me. I could feel the weight of it, like he was studying me. "Do you come here often?" he asked, moving from behind the counter and walking toward me. "Not really. Just passing through," I answered, hoping my short responses would deter him from further questions. "Oh, really? You should visit more. It gets pretty quiet around here, especially at night," he said, his enthusiasm not fading. I glanced around, feeling a little uncomfortable. The store felt empty, the shelves casting long shadows. "Yeah, it must," I replied, trying to keep my voice light. He continued to chat about the area, but I tuned him out, focusing on the coffee as I added cream and sugar. After a few minutes, I decided it was best to wrap things up. I paid for my coffee and headed towards the door. As I stepped outside, the cold air hit me like a slap. I took a deep breath, feeling slightly better away from the cramped store. Just as I turned to head to my car, I heard the bell jingle again. I glanced back to see the clerk standing in the doorway, his face suddenly serious. "Wait. You shouldn't go out there," he shouted, causing me to freeze. "What?" I asked, confusion flooding my mind. "There is someone dangerous waiting for you in the parking lot," he insisted, his voice dropping to a whisper, eyes darting around as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. I looked around the lot, but I didn't see anyone. Just the flickering lights and the occasional rustle of leaves. "I think I will be fine," I said, attempting to sound calm, though my heart started racing. "No, please," he said, stepping closer to me. "I am serious. I have seen this before. You need to come back inside." The urgency in his voice raised a sense of panic in my chest. I glanced back at my car, feeling the distance between us grow. "What do you mean?" I asked, not wanting to believe him but feeling the weight of his words. He took another step toward me, lowering his voice. "Just trust me. I can help you. I don't want you to get hurt." The intensity in his eyes felt like a warning bell, but I could not tell if it was genuine concern or something darker. "What do you know?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "I can't explain right now, but please, just come back inside with me," he urged, his expression shifting from urgency to something that felt almost desperate. I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to get away. "I'm fine, really," I said, trying to sound firm, but the uncertainty in my voice betrayed me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure emerging from the shadows near my car. I squinted, heart pounding as the shape came into view. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, hands shoved deep in his pockets. He watched me intently, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. Fear shot through me. "I need to go," I said, my voice stronger now. "No!" "You can't," the clerk yelled, reaching out as if to grab me. I turned on my heel and bolted toward my car, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I fumbled with my keys as I ran, glancing back to see the clerk still standing in the doorway, his face a mask of worry. The man in the hood shifted, stepping closer, and I could feel my pulse racing even faster. I managed to unlock my car, throwing myself inside and locking the doors just as I heard the clerk yell again, "Get back in here." I slammed the engine into gear and sped out of the lot, tires squealing against the asphalt. I didn't dare look back. My mind raced with questions. Who was that man? What did the clerk know? As I drove away, I felt the tightness in my chest begin to ease, but the unease lingered. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus on the road ahead. I did not stop until I reached a well-lit area, far from that store. I pulled into a gas station that was still open, the lights bright and welcoming. I parked and sat in the car for a moment, trembling as I tried to process what had just happened. I could still feel the eyes of the man in the parking lot on me, haunting my thoughts. After a while, I stepped out of the car, shaking slightly but feeling safer in the light. The clerk's words echoed in my mind, but I didn't want to dwell on them. I needed to move on, to forget the fear that had gripped me just moments before. I made my way inside the gas station, greeted by the friendly face of the cashier. As I stood there, I tried to shake off the lingering dread, reminding myself that I had escaped. I would never go back to that store again. The thought of those dim lights and the clerk's intense gaze made me shudder, but at least I was safe now. No one could follow me here. I could breathe again, knowing that darkness couldn't reach me in the glow of those fluorescent lights. I had escaped, and for now, that was enough. It was late, maybe close to midnight, when I decided it was time to head home after spending the evening at my friend's house. The night was clear, with stars twinkling in the sky, but the streetlights flickered like they were struggling to stay alive. I had walked this route many times before, but tonight felt different. I felt uneasy, like there was a weight in the air that I couldn't shake off. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, I could hear the distant sound of my footsteps echoing off the pavement. The quiet was unsettling. I glanced down the street and noticed a figure walking towards me. At first, I thought nothing of it. Just someone out for a late stroll, I figured. But as I continued walking, I felt a strange sensation crawling up my spine. Something about the figure felt wrong. The stranger was still far away, but I could see them clearly. The person walked at a steady pace, matching my own. I quickened my step, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I glanced back again, and the figure was closer. My stomach tightened. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Perhaps they were just another late-night walker. I picked up my pace even more, trying to shake the sense of dread that was creeping in. I turned the corner, hoping to lose sight of them, but when I looked back, they were still there, just a few yards behind me. My heart started pounding in my chest. I quickened my pace again, this time nearly breaking into a jog. The footsteps echoed louder, and I could hear the crunch of gravel under their shoes, keeping rhythm with mine. I stole another glance back, and that was when I noticed the figure had picked up speed too. They were closing in. Panic bubbled up inside me. The street was quiet, too quiet, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than before. I took a deep breath, telling myself to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. I turned onto a side street, hoping the change in direction would help. But as I glanced back again, I saw that they had turned with me. Now, I could see the details more clearly. Their clothes were dark, a hood pulled low over their face. I couldn't make out any features, but something about their posture felt predatory, like a wolf stalking its prey. I forced myself to focus on moving, but my legs felt heavy, weighed down by fear. I turned another corner, nearly sprinting now. My mind raced through scenarios. What if they were following me? Why? I looked around for any sign of life. The houses were dark, their windows blank and uninviting. I felt so alone in that moment. I was nearing a small park that cut through the neighborhood, a shortcut I often took. I didn't want to go through, but I felt the need to put distance between myself and the figure behind me. As I entered the park, I could hear the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere in the night. It was slightly comforting, but the fear still gripped me. I glanced back again, and that was when I saw it. The figure had stopped at the edge of the park, just outside the light of the street lamp. It stood still, watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine. The thought that I might be in danger hit me hard. I turned my attention back to the path ahead and started walking faster. As I made my way through the park, the darkness seemed to press in around me. I could still feel their presence, the weight of their gaze lingering on my back. I wanted to call out, to shout for help, but the words stuck in my throat. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I needed to be quiet. Finally, I reached the other side of the park. I could see the lights of my neighborhood ahead, a beacon of safety in the darkness. I picked up my pace, nearly breaking into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I glanced over my shoulder one last time. The figure was still there, standing in the shadows at the park entrance, watching. I burst onto the main road, and for a moment, I felt a rush of relief. I could see cars passing by, people out and about. But my relief was short-lived. As I crossed the street, I looked back again. The figure had started moving, stepping into the streetlight's glow for the first time. They were closer now, their face still hidden beneath the hood, but there was something about their movement that made me freeze. It was deliberate, slow, as if they enjoyed the chase. Fear gripped my throat, and I turned back to the street ahead. I had to get home. I had to reach safety. I could see my apartment building in the distance, just a few more blocks. I ran, heart pounding, adrenaline fueling my every step. I could hear the sound of my own breathing echoing in my ears. I didn't dare look back again, focused solely on reaching the entrance of my building. Each step felt like a victory as I approached. Finally, I reached the front door, fumbling with my keys. My hand shook as I unlocked it and pushed inside. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my heart racing as I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I looked through the peephole, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. The figure stood outside for a moment, scanning the area, as if trying to locate me. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't knock. I was terrified, thinking they might try to get in. But then, after what felt like an eternity, they turned and walked away, back into the shadows from where they had come. I felt my body start to relax, but the fear still lingered. I backed away from the door, my heart still racing, unsure of what just happened. After a few minutes, I turned on all the lights, making sure the windows were locked. I didn't dare venture outside again that night. I tried to calm myself, convincing myself that I was safe now, that it was over. I stayed awake for a long time, waiting for the dawn, grateful for the light that would chase away the darkness, and hoping I wouldn't see that figure again. It was one of those restless nights when sleep felt elusive. I tossed and turned, trying to find a comfortable position. The clock on my bedside table ticked steadily, but all I could hear was the silence of my home, an oppressive quiet that seemed to hang in the air. I finally drifted off, the weight of the day pulling me under. I awoke suddenly to the piercing shriek of my smoke alarm. The sound was jarring, cutting through the stillness like a knife. I shot up in bed, adrenaline flooding my system. My heart raced as I glanced around the room, expecting to see smoke curling through the air or flames licking at the walls. But everything seemed fine. The faint glow of my digital clock read 2:13 a.m., and I felt a little embarrassed for waking up like that. I padded into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. I knew I had to check the kitchen and living room, so I made my way to those areas first. I turned off the alarm, which still blared loudly, and opened the window to air out the room. I looked around the kitchen, then the living room. Nothing. Everything was in its place. I sighed, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was a malfunction. I stepped back toward the bedroom when I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart sank, and I froze. I turned my head slowly, peering through the window. There was someone in my backyard. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as I squinted into the darkness, I saw a figure crouched low, moving carefully between the trees. The light from my porch illuminated just enough for me to see that it was a person. A surge of panic washed over me. My mind raced. What were they doing? Why were they in my yard at this hour? I grabbed my phone from the table, thinking about calling the police, but I didn't want to take my eyes off the figure. I knew I had to confront them, to see what they were doing. I took a deep breath and whispered through the window, "Hey, what are you doing?" The figure froze, and for a brief moment, I thought they might turn and run. But they remained still, crouched low as if trying to blend in with the shadows. I pressed my face closer to the window, trying to see better. There was a moment of silence, and then the figure shifted, standing upright. "Hey! Get out of my yard!" I called out again, my voice sharper this time, filled with an urgency I did not feel. The figure finally turned, but instead of responding, they dashed toward the back of the yard, moving with a speed that took me by surprise. "Stop!" I shouted, instinctively pushing the window open wider, wanting to get a better view of the intruder. I could feel my heart racing, pounding against my chest. I needed to know who this person was and why they were here. The figure dashed for the fence, their movements quick and agile. I could barely make out their features. They wore a dark hoodie, the fabric obscuring their face, and their jeans were tattered. I felt a chill run down my spine. They were close to the fence now, and without thinking, I yelled again, "What do you want?" They paused for a moment, looking back at me, and for a second, our eyes met. My breath hitched in my throat as I tried to gauge their intentions. I felt exposed, standing there with nothing but my pajamas. All the bravado I had summoned seemed to drain away, replaced by an unsettling fear. Then, without a word, they turned and scrambled over the fence, disappearing into the darkness on the other side. I stood frozen, trying to catch my breath. The sudden silence enveloped me, leaving me feeling more vulnerable than ever. I stared at the fence for a long time, waiting for any sign of movement. I considered calling the police, but I hesitated, unsure if there was even a point. Was there really someone there? Had I imagined the whole thing? My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. I finally moved away from the window and closed it tightly. I felt foolish, standing there in my pajamas, a wave of embarrassment washing over me. Perhaps it was just a raccoon or some other animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I locked the door and made sure the windows were secured. In the kitchen, I made myself a cup of tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. I stood by the window, watching the darkness outside, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. I tried to convince myself that I was safe, that everything was fine, but the unsettling feeling lingered. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me, still shaken by the encounter. I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing, replaying the moment over and over again. Had it all been real? Or had I dreamed it? As dawn broke, the sun casting a pale light into my room, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I told myself that it was over. I could go outside, check the yard, and see if there was any sign of what had happened. When I finally mustered the courage to step outside, I scanned the yard. Everything seemed normal, the grass still wet with dew, the fence standing firm. I walked over to where I had seen the figure and found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish for letting my imagination run wild. Maybe the smoke alarm had caused some kind of panic that led me to see things that were not there. I shook my head, determined to put it behind me. But as I walked back inside, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of my mind. I glanced back at the fence one last time, half expecting to see the figure reappear. There was nothing. Just the quiet of the morning. I locked the door again and decided to stay alert. I could not shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, I was not entirely alone. It all started when I noticed my neighbor sitting on the stairs at odd hours. I live in a small apartment building, and the walls are thin enough that I could hear most things happening nearby. My neighbor was a man named Derek. He was in his late 30s, quiet most of the time. He kept to himself, which I thought was normal. However, over the last week, he began appearing on the stairs, often late at night. At first, I brushed it off. He might have just been having a tough time, or maybe he liked the cool air. But as the days went on, it became unsettling. I would look out my peephole and see him sitting there, his head lowered, staring at the ground, or worse, staring directly at my door. I felt uncomfortable each time I saw him. I started to avoid the common areas, taking the stairs only when I was sure he wasn't around. The elevator felt safer, even if it meant waiting for it to arrive. I thought it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A few days into his odd behavior, I began receiving strange messages from an unknown number. The first message read, "I see you." I thought it was a prank. Maybe someone had gotten my number wrong or was trying to scare me. I ignored it. But the next night, another message arrived, "You should lock your door." My heart raced, and I immediately checked my locks, making sure everything was secure. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. But the messages kept coming. "I know you love to read," followed by "You should try that new coffee shop." I had mentioned my favorite books to a friend a few days prior, and I had just been to that coffee shop last week. It felt too personal, like someone was watching me closely. I decided to tell my friend about it, hoping she would have some advice. When I met her for coffee, I tried to sound lighthearted, but my unease seeped into my words. She told me I was being paranoid, that there were many explanations for odd behavior and messages. I wanted to believe her, but I could not shake the feeling of dread creeping over me. One night, after a long day at work, I returned home later than usual. I was exhausted and hardly noticed anything as I entered the building. I walked past Derek, who was sitting on the stairs again, but this time he looked up at me. Our eyes met, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something in his gaze that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. I hurried to my apartment, locked the door behind me, and took a deep breath. I needed to calm down. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but the nagging feeling of being watched lingered. I glanced at my phone, hoping for a distraction, but instead saw another message from the unknown number. "Let me in. I know you're home." Panic surged through me. I quickly turned off the TV and sat in silence, listening to the quiet of my apartment. My heart pounded in my chest as I debated what to do. Should I call the police? I didn't want to overreact, but the next thing I heard made my blood run cold. A soft sound echoed through my apartment, a gentle scraping noise. I stood up, my heart racing, and walked cautiously toward the door. The noise continued, low and persistent, like something being fiddled with. Then, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. I staggered backward, my breath hitching in my throat. How could this be happening? I didn't want to believe it, but I knew. Derek was trying to unlock my door. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling the coolness of the paint against my skin. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Should I confront him? Should I call the police? My fingers shook as I reached for my phone, but I hesitated. If I called the police, he might hear me. He could be inside before they arrived. Then the turning stopped. I held my breath, straining to listen. The air felt thick with tension, as if the world around me had slowed down. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps retreating, fading away into the hallway. I stood still for a moment, frozen, listening for any sign of him. I tiptoed to the peephole, peeking out into the dimly lit hallway. I saw him standing a few feet away, his back turned to me, as if he was deciding what to do next. I took a step back, my heart racing, and dialed 911. My hands shook as I spoke to the operator, whispering as quietly as I could. I explained what happened, and they assured me help was on the way. The seconds felt like hours as I waited. I glanced out again, but Derek was gone. Had he returned to his apartment? I had no idea. I felt trapped in my own home. I was scared to even breathe too loudly. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens approaching. I felt a mix of relief and fear. Would they find Derek? What if he had already left? A soft knock on my door made me jump. Police. Open up. I quickly unlocked the door, my hands trembling. I opened it just enough to let them in. 2 officers stepped inside, looking serious and alert. I explained everything, my voice shaky as I recounted the messages, the strange behavior, and the attempt to unlock my door. They nodded, taking notes, asking me questions about Derek. After a few minutes, they decided to check on him. I watched through the window as they knocked on his door. My heart raced, hoping they would find him. They were gone for what felt like a long time. When they returned, they had Derek with them. He looked confused, almost dazed. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he did not seem aggressive or hostile. They talked to him for a moment before turning to me. He says he was just looking out for you. He thought you might need help. The words sent chills down my spine. I felt sick at the thought that he had been watching me all this time. They took him aside to question him further. One of the officers approached me again. You did the right thing by calling us. We will have extra patrols in this area. If you feel unsafe, don't hesitate to call. I thanked them, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders, but I knew I could not shake the feeling of fear completely. Derek was still my neighbor, and even if he was harmless now, I couldn't forget what had happened. As the officers left with Derek, I took a deep breath, knowing I needed to change my routine. I would have to keep my door locked at all times and be more cautious. But at least I was safe for now. I glanced out the window one last time, watching as they led him away. I knew I would never look at my home the same way again. I spent the night at my late grandmother's old house after it had been sitting empty for months. It felt strange being there without her. I had a lot of memories in that house, and I hoped to find some comfort in familiar places. The old wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the wallpaper was peeling in places. It was a little spooky but familiar. I had settled in for the night, trying to ignore the eerie silence. I was halfway through an old photo album when I heard a loud crash. It startled me, making me jump and nearly drop the album. My heart raced. I had thought I was alone in the house. I listened carefully, straining to hear anything else. Silence hung in the air, thick and unsettling. I got up and walked cautiously toward the living room. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated the room, and I saw it immediately: a broken window. Shattered glass lay on the floor, glinting in the light. The curtains fluttered slightly as the wind blew through the gap. I felt a surge of anxiety. I stepped closer, looking around, but there was no one there. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just the wind? A stray animal? The thought of someone breaking in sent a shiver down my spine. I took a deep breath, convincing myself I needed to check the rest of the house. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, the beam of light cutting through the shadows as I moved deeper into the house. I made my way to the hallway first. I scanned each room as I passed. Everything appeared untouched. My grandmother's old bedroom still had the quilt on the bed and her perfume lingering in the air. I stopped to check the bathroom. Nothing seemed amiss. I felt a little foolish for being so scared. As I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed the door to the basement was slightly ajar. I could see darkness beyond it. My heart thudded in my chest. I hesitated, considering whether to open the door. I had never liked the basement. It always felt cold and unwelcoming. But I had to know. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly. The stairs descended into darkness, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I took a deep breath and started down the steps, the beam of my flashlight flickering against the damp walls. I reached the bottom and swept the light around. The basement was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and dust-covered items that had been forgotten over the years. As I moved deeper, I noticed something strange. There were footprints on the floor, fresh ones. I froze, my heart racing. They looked like they belonged to someone wearing boots, leading deeper into the shadows. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to turn back. But I was too curious, too terrified to just walk away. I followed the footprints, my flashlight trembling in my hand. They led to a small room in the corner. The door was half open, and as I approached, I noticed it was filled with old blankets, clothes, and various personal items that did not belong to my grandmother. I could feel panic rising in my throat. Someone had been living here. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight over the makeshift bed of blankets and the pile of clothes. My heart sank. In the corner, I spotted a tattered notebook. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with frantic writing, thoughts that seemed disjointed and frantic. They spoke of someone watching, someone who seemed to be living in the shadows, observing. I felt sick. I quickly glanced around, my breathing loud in the silence. I needed to leave. I backed out of the room, trying to make as little noise as possible. But then, I heard a faint rustling sound from behind me. My blood turned cold. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. Just the shadows. I turned to run back upstairs, the flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. I reached the bottom of the steps and heard the rustling again, louder this time. I didn't look back. I raced up the stairs and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it. I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding, trying to gather my thoughts. I needed to call for help. I fumbled for my phone, but it had no signal. My hand shook, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Just then, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside. I froze. They were slow and deliberate. Someone was in the house. I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing. I needed to think. I had to find a way out without being seen. I quickly moved to my grandmother's bedroom, closing the door quietly behind me. I peeked through the crack to see if I could catch a glimpse of whoever was in the house. I heard the footsteps getting closer. They stopped outside her door. I held my breath. The door creaked open slowly. A figure stepped inside. It was a man, maybe in his 30s. His clothes were worn, and his face was dirty. He looked around the room, searching. My heart raced. I knew I had to act fast. I darted across the room to the window. I managed to slide it open just enough to squeeze through. I climbed out and landed on the grass below. The cold air hit me hard, but I didn't stop to feel it. I ran toward the side of the house, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that man as possible. I raced through the backyard, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced back at the house and saw him standing at the window, looking out. I could barely see his face, but I could feel his eyes on me. I made it to the front of the house and ran to my car parked on the street. My hand shook as I fumbled for my keys. I could still feel his gaze on me. I finally found them and unlocked the door, throwing myself inside. I locked the doors and started the engine. As I pulled away, I glanced back at the house one last time. The man was gone, but I knew he had been there, lurking in the shadows. I drove away, my heart still racing, knowing I had escaped whatever nightmare had taken root in that old house. I never went back. The memories of that night haunted me. The feeling of being watched lingered long after I had left. I told myself I would never set foot in that place again. The old house, with its creaks and whispers, had become a prison I never wanted to return to. It was a chilly evening when I went to visit the old shopping mall. I had heard stories about how I was left to rot after the last store closed years ago. The idea of exploring such a place gave me a rush. It was risky, but I craved the thrill of doing something so reckless. I parked my car in the nearly empty lot, the faint glow of the setting sun barely illuminating the entrance. Once I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The air felt heavy, filled with dust and a faint odor of mold. The darkness seemed to swallow me as I walked further into the mall. I could see the outline of the old shops. Some still had remnants of their signs, while others were completely covered in graffiti. I took out my phone to use the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating scattered debris on the floor. As I walked through the deserted corridors, I heard my footsteps echoing off the walls. I paused to listen, but only silence greeted me. That made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shrugged it off, reminding myself that it was just an empty building. I turned the corner and saw the food court, long abandoned. The tables were overturned, and a few chairs lay scattered. I approached one of the windows, half covered in grime, and peered outside. The sky was a deep blue, and I could see the last remnants of daylight fading away. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me. My heart dropped. I spun around and saw a man coming towards me. He wore a security uniform, but something about him felt off. His eyes were too wide, and a grin stretched across his face. "Hey there," he called out. "What are you doing here?" "I'm just exploring," I replied, trying to sound confident. He chuckled, the sound echoing through the empty mall. "You know, this place can be dangerous at night. You shouldn't be wandering alone." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "I'll be fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Come on, let me show you the best spots. You'll love it." I hesitated. I didn't want to seem rude, but something about him made me uneasy. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I followed him deeper into the mall. As we walked, he pointed out areas of interest. "This was the old arcade," he said, gesturing to a darkened space filled with old machines covered in dust. "And over there used to be a movie theater." The more we walked, the more I felt his gaze on me. It was as if he was studying me, and it made me uncomfortable. "You come here often?" I asked, trying to break the tension. "Oh, I know this place inside out," he replied, a strange glint in his eye. "I've worked here for a while." I felt a shiver run down my spine. "Oh, really?" I didn't see a security vehicle outside. He waved his hand dismissively. "The car's parked on the other side. Don't worry about that." As we reached a dark hallway, I noticed the flickering fluorescent lights above us. "This part is the creepiest," he said, his voice lowering. "A lot of people don't like coming down here." I felt a rush of fear. "Maybe I should head back," I suggested, taking a step toward the exit. "Wait. Just a little further. I promise it will be worth it," he insisted, stepping closer. His demeanor shifted. I could see the excitement in his eyes, but it felt wrong. I hesitated. "I really think I should go." He stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Come on, don't be scared. I just want to show you something cool." I could feel panic rising in my chest. I glanced back toward the exit, but the way out felt far away now. "I really need to go," I said, my voice shaking slightly. He took a step closer, invading my personal space. "You're not scared of a little darkness, are you?" I took a step back, my instinct screaming at me to run. "I'm not scared. I just have to go now." "Just a little longer," he urged, his voice turning soft and almost pleading. "You'll regret it if you leave now." I felt trapped. I turned and bolted down the hallway, my heart pounding. I heard his footsteps behind me, quick and heavy. I ran as fast as I could, dodging debris and old furniture. I didn't dare look back, fearing what I might see. I reached the food court and spotted the exit sign glowing in the dim light. I pushed through the tables, desperate to get outside. I could hear him getting closer, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. My breath came in short gasps as I sprinted toward the exit. I reached the door and yanked it open. The cold night air hit my face as I stumbled outside. I could hear his voice calling after me, but I didn't stop to listen. I ran toward my car, my heart racing. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I could hear him behind me, but I didn't look back. Finally, I found them and unlocked the door. I jumped inside and locked it just as he reached the parking lot. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, a dark figure against the lights of the mall. I started the car and slammed it into reverse. My tires screeched against the pavement as I backed out of the space and turned onto the road. I didn't stop until I was far away, my heart still pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze on me, even after I left the mall behind. I vowed never to return. The thrill I had sought turned into a nightmare, and I realized some adventures are better left unexplored. I finished my shift late that night. The clock read 1:30 a.m. when I decided to stop at the diner just outside of town. I felt tired, my stomach growling as I stepped through the door. The bell above jingled softly, announcing my arrival. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, welcoming me into the dimly lit space. The diner had a few patrons scattered throughout, but the place was mostly empty. I took a seat at the counter, the smooth, cool surface feeling comforting beneath my arms. A waitress with tired eyes approached me, her notepad in hand. "What can I get you?" she asked. I ordered a burger and a side of fries, and she shuffled off to the kitchen. As I waited, I glanced around the diner. In a booth at the back, there was a group of 4 men. They looked like they had been drinking. Their voices were low, but I could catch snippets of their conversation. They glanced at me, then whispered among themselves, their heads huddled close. I tried to shrug it off, thinking it was just my imagination. But every few seconds, I could feel their eyes on me. The waitress returned with my food, placing it in front of me with a small smile. I thanked her and dug in, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I stole another glance at the booth. The men were still looking at me, their whispers growing more animated. My stomach turned slightly. I tried to focus on my meal, but I could not stop thinking about them. As I finished eating, I decided it was best to pay and leave. I walked to the register, the sound of my footsteps echoing softly in the quiet diner. I pulled out my wallet, and just as I was about to pay, I heard their voices again. "Yeah, he looks like an easy target," one of the men said, his voice low but clear. "Let's follow him home." "It'll be fun," another one replied, snickering. A chill ran down my spine. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help it. I turned slightly, catching a glimpse of their smirks. My heart raced as I realized they were serious. They were planning something, and I was their target. I paid the waitress quickly, my hands shaking. I needed to get out of there. I turned and walked toward the exit, my mind racing. I pushed through the door and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. The parking lot was dimly lit, shadows stretching across the asphalt. I glanced around for my car, feeling panic bubble in my chest. There it was, parked near the edge of the lot. I hurried toward it, trying to stay calm. Just as I reached my car, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned slightly and saw the 4 men coming out of the diner. They were laughing, but their eyes were fixed on me. My heart pounded. "Hey! You forgot your tip," one of them shouted, and they broke into laughter. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I unlocked the door and slipped inside, locking it just as they reached the car. I could hear their footsteps getting closer, the sound echoing in my ears. I looked up through the window and saw them standing just outside my door, their faces lit by the glow of the streetlight. "Come on, man. We just want to talk," one of them said, leaning against my window. I didn't respond. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to keep my breathing steady. I wanted to leave, but I knew that starting the car would draw their attention. "Don't be like that," another one chimed in. "We're just curious about you." I glanced in the rearview mirror. There was no one else in the parking lot, just the faint light from the diner. I felt trapped. I had to get out of there. The man at my window leaned closer, a grin spreading across his face. "You're not going to just leave us, are you?" I felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice shaking. They exchanged glances, and I could see their amusement fade. "Why don't you get out? We're just having some fun." In that moment, I made a decision. I had to act fast. I put the keys in the ignition and started the engine, the sound echoing in the quiet lot. The men stepped back, surprised. "Hey! Wait!" one of them shouted as I shifted into reverse. I backed out quickly, my heart racing. I didn't look back as I sped out of the lot, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I felt a rush of relief as I turned onto the main road, the diner fading behind me. My hands trembled on the wheel, but I kept driving, pushing the fear down. I was safe, and that was all that mattered. I glanced in my rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see them following me. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching ahead. I drove for a while, the adrenaline slowly fading. I kept reminding myself that I had escaped. As I turned onto my street, I felt the weight of the night lift slightly. I pulled into my driveway, turned off the car, and took a deep breath. I was home. Safe. But the encounter haunted me long after. The thought of those men and their intentions lingered in my mind. I promised myself never to take chances like that again. Sometimes, the thrill just isn't worth it.